The story begins in the year 196 of the Julian calendar. A new sun, the brightest and most powerful in the continent's history, arose in the country. At this time, a new emperor was born. The name Sionel Ulysses Woodburg. Sionel was the second prince who strongly resembled the country's first emperor. He had the same blonde hair and blue eyes. It even went so far as to call him the reincarnation of the first emperor. However, he was born to a simple servant girl. The empress and prince considered him a threat, so they forced him to remain quiet and inconspicuous. Nevertheless, he survived all the hardships and was able to grow in power. He won the struggle for the throne and overthrew the empress and the prince, thus securing the crown. But there was another reason for his fame: the flower that grew in hell. Despite his sculptural beauty, he was given this nickname for his fighting skills and composure. People told how one prestigious noble family tried to persuade him to marry, but many heard that in the end, the idea failed because the emperor was against it. Many people tried to negotiate a marriage, but he paid them no attention. Incidentally, Sionel always had a loyal knight at his side. This knight is our heroine, Lindell Bodbachne, who, having perfected her aura at a young age and earned the nickname of a genius knight, sided with the second prince. The knights who followed her also joined Sionel's forces, and he emerged victorious in the battle for the throne. She was his right hand and his finest knight. That is why the new emperor blessed Lindell, and the empire had a bright future as long as these two existed. However, on the day of the coronation, something happened. The emperor asked Lindell to repeat his words. For some unknown reason, our heroine told him that she wanted to leave the palace. Sionel, perplexed, suggested he had a hearing problem. The knight who promised to be his right-hand man wanted to abandon him at the coronation ceremony. He did not understand how he should agree to this, and therefore asked to explain the reason to him. Just as the girl was about to begin her story with explanations, suddenly at that moment, she began to cough. Sionel told her in a quiet voice that she had not been using her aura lately, and he had been told that she had been vomiting blood. Turning to her, he said he couldn't believe it. Could it really be true? Was this really why she wanted to leave him? Lindell, confused, began to tell His Majesty that she didn't know what he was thinking, but everything wasn't as it seemed. His reaction, however, was different from her expectations. Since the Empire had plenty of excellent knights, she just had to explain everything clearly. The girl said she was fine. After all, she'd always been healthy. The guy looked at her with tears in his eyes and asked in bewilderment if she really wanted him to believe these words after she coughed up blood. Sitting down next to her, he said that she had always been the type to endure anything for him, and even this time she had decided to simply run away so as not to bother them with her illness. Lindell couldn't believe the emperor was crying and couldn't understand what he was talking about. She told His Majesty she wasn't ill. However, he said she didn't have to lie to him. He asked her to be honest with him, because that was the only thing he could expect from her. What could they do? Sionel said they could bring healers, or if they couldn't, they would seek priests. He would search the entire empire to find a cure. He hugged her and asked her not to even think about leaving him and facing death alone. Pressing his face against her shoulder, he asked her not to leave him, because he would not allow even death to take her away. Continuing to hug her, he assured her that she would never die and that she should not do this. While Sionel held on to her so tightly, our heroine had no idea that he thought so much about her. But there was one thing, however, that would certainly surprise those around her. She's not dying! Sionel decided she had an incurable disease because of events that happened 6 months ago. That night was no different from any other, and it all started in her room. Once inside, she could only exhale heavily, saying how tired she was. She'd had a lot of training that day, and she returned to her room exhausted. She didn't understand why everything was so difficult today, when everything was as usual. Holding her shoulders, the girl sighed heavily and said that they hurt a lot. At that very moment, she heard a strange rustling sound behind her, so she immediately turned around and asked the stranger who he was. A voice began to laugh, telling the vice commander of the Emperor's Guard that her senses were quite keen. Our heroine, standing still, couldn't understand this strange feeling. She'd never felt anything like it. At that moment, an unknown energy swirling around our heroine said that she was a black dragon. Soon after these words, she finally stopped and landed on the floor of the room. It was a black Larocque. Our heroine, perplexed, asked her what she was doing there. When did she even show up? Lindell hadn't even sensed her presence. The girl at that moment told Lindell that she was considered the best knight in the Empire, and she had come to offer a deal. With a wave of her hand, the woman asked Lindell Bodabachna to sign a contract with her. Our heroine looked around in confusion and asked what this meant. Larocque told her that she had to help her. Thanks to this, her deepest desire will come true. If she has a clear goal, it will be fulfilled immediately, and this is an unparalleled opportunity. Lindell asked again, surprised if she was telling the truth. Was it really possible to do anything? Black Larocque smiled sweetly at the girl and said it was all true. She could do anything if she signed a contract with her. Naturally, our heroine immediately decided to inquire about the terms. After all, there's no such thing as free generosity. Larocque said that her real body existed in this world, and that she had to find it and break the seal. She thought the Empire's young genius could handle it. Lindell was surprised by the mention of a body and decided to ask what was standing before her now. The girl said she couldn't say why it was sealed. She was forced to place her soul into this temporary monobody, and this form would last for a year. During this time, she must break the seal on her real body. Born the illegitimate daughter of a noble family, she always longed to be recognized by her father and then become stronger once she took up a sword. After meeting Sionel, she wanted to make him emperor. No matter how hard you try, it's hard to make sense of someone else's feelings. Sionel became one. But Lindell never earned the recognition of her family. The man she wanted to attract never looked at her. But with the power of a dragon, was it even possible? Without thinking twice, she decided to agree. Soon the contract was signed. Our heroine wanted it so much that she made the decision without hesitation. However, she didn't want this. Coughing up blood was a side effect of adapting to dragon energy, but she couldn't talk about it, and her body was healthy. She didn't know if the emperor would believe her, so she decided to first say that she was not ill. Lindell wanted to say something, but Sionel interrupted her and said that she would never leave him, and even death would not take her. Our heroine knew he wouldn't believe her. She said, however, that she had always been His Majesty's knight and protected him, so she wouldn't die so easily. Looking at him, she reiterated that she wasn't dying and knew her body better than he did. Coughing up blood might have been surprising, but she was fine. Immediately after these words, the emperor took the Lindell sword and addressed the knights. He cried out and said that from that moment on, Lindell Bodabachna would lose his knighthood. She will be placed in the northern palace, and going outside is strictly prohibited. Looking at them, he ordered them not to even think about setting foot there without his permission. Then he looked at Lindell and said that she was forbidden to leave the palace. After this, he turned his head to the side and ordered the knights to take Lindell out of his sight. Our heroine couldn't understand how this could have happened. As soon as they began to lift her, the girl asked His Majesty to wait. However, the knights urged her to follow them silently. Lindell couldn't understand what the hell was going on. Were they in a cheap novel? Let's recap again. It was the year 196, according to the imperial calendar, and our heroine, Lindell Bodabachna, faced a terrible situation on the day she resigned as a knight. At this time, the knights had just shoved Lindell into one of the rooms and told her to sit still. On this day, by order of Emperor Sionel, the man she loves, she was locked in the palace. The next morning, a maid entered Lady Lindell's room and asked if she was awake. She soon apologized for the intrusion. This faithful servant was Lindell's maid Luna, who told our heroine that she had not eaten for several days, so she advised her to have at least a little snack. However, the girl was not in the mood for food, so she asked the maid to leave the food there and she would eat later. Luna came closer and asked the lady not to say that, because it was better to eat while everything was warm. Still, Lindell stood her ground. Luna was worried, as this would definitely make things worse for the lady. The girl thought to herself that she couldn't get anything down. She'd been locked here for a week, even though she hadn't accomplished anything. Our heroine couldn't tell the emperor everything, even though she wanted to explain that she wasn't ill, but he wouldn't give her a chance. Would he visit her if she didn't eat or drink anything? However, her plan failed because Her Majesty the Emperor had never come to see her before. Luna was very upset. At that moment, she told the lady that the chef had made duck soup, as he'd heard it was Lindell's favorite dish. Was she really sure she didn't want to try it? As soon as our heroine heard the combination of the words chef and soup for her, she was shocked by what this arrogant old man was cooking for her. Soon the girl began lifting the lid and telling the lady that everyone was worried about her. Because she hadn't eaten anything, Luna asked her to accept the chef's sincerity and eat at least a couple of spoonfuls. She started playing on pity, talking about how sad it would be to throw it all away. Lindell tempted herself for a long time. But still, if Luna asks so, since ancient times, it has been known that knights should not make girls cry. And it is definitely not about the delicious duck soup, but about the fact that she needs to follow the knightly code. Soon she coughed and said she could eat a little to show respect to the cook. Luna was incredibly pleased to hear these words. In that case, she said she'd get everything ready for the table. Our heroine decided to remind him that she didn't have much of an appetite. Luna told her not to say those words because she needed to eat properly at least a little. Looking at Lindell, she said that her body was already not in good shape and that it required more strength to fight off illnesses. Our heroine was tired of thinking she wasn't sick. But if she didn't find Larocque's body within a year, real problems would arise. She'd planned to start searching right away rather than get stuck here. At that moment, Luna told the lady that everything would be fine because she would always be there and she would become her strength. Looking at the maid, our heroine couldn't understand why she looked as if she wanted to take her apart. Her gaze was so heavy. Lindell laughed and told the maid that everything was fine, but she just needed to remember one thing. She wasn't sick. Luna smiled and said she understood perfectly. Because of this sarcastic response, Lindell realized she wasn't being listened to at all. But why didn't anyone believe her, and what should she do? How could she leave this place and begin searching for Larocque's body? In any case, at this point, Luna set the table and wished the lady bon appetit. Our heroine decided to put all her thoughts aside, thinking that first she should eat and then think about the rest. But at that very moment, the servant said that His Majesty the Emperor had come to her room. The girl placed her fork on the table, indicating she hadn't eaten anything. Just then, Sinel approached her and addressed her. Looking at the dish, he told her in bewilderment that she hadn't even eaten a spoonful. Was she really refusing to eat? Lindell was shocked. It must have happened because he came into her room. At that moment, he grabbed her by the shoulder and asked why she was doing this. Why was she now planning to starve to death? Lindell asked the emperor what he was talking about, and why was he angry anyway? Meanwhile, the emperor asked if she really wanted to say that a former knight who couldn't even stand this was normal. Our heroine slapped his hand off her shoulder and reminded him again that she'd said she wasn't sick. Why hadn't he realized yet that this was a misunderstanding? Cyanal suddenly screamed and asked her to explain to him why she was coughing up blood right in front of his eyes. Our heroine instantly looked away. It was all because of the contract, but unfortunately, she couldn't tell him that. The guy sighed heavily and soon turned to the priest and asked him to come to the girl and help her. The man approached her, took her hand, and decided to take her pulse. No matter how much you take it, he won't understand anything. Our heroine understood that it was impossible for an ordinary person to feel a contract with a dragon. After a brief silence, the priest noted that her pulse was a little unstable and her strength had diminished. Cyanal asked why. He'd given his healer a week, so it couldn't be that he hadn't found anything. Looking at the priest, the boy said he should understand what would happen to him if he didn't find a cure. At that very moment, the man fell to the ground and began screaming, asking to be killed, because he didn't understand the reason at all. Lindell screamed in bewilderment and begged His Majesty to stop this immediately. An innocent man shouldn't suffer because of her. The healer stood up and looked at the girl. Our heroine told him it wasn't his fault, so he could rest easy. Once again, our heroine said that no matter how long she stayed here in the end, they would never find out the reasons. Incidentally, she couldn't tell the truth, but she had to quickly change Sinel's mind to get out of here. The girl looked at the emperor and asked him to send her away. Cyanal sighed heavily and told her that he had given her a week to sort herself out. But he never would have thought that it would lead her to such useless thoughts. And after looking at the healer, he said he wasn't much use. He'd bring every healer in the empire, though he'd rather search the entire world to cure her. The emperor looked at his right hand and told it not to think about any nonsense and to stay here further. However, looking at the sword holster, the girl said that her role in the palace was over. The prince she helped has already become the emperor he aspired to be. The empire's borders are now stronger than ever. The girl also told Sionel that he controls the situation inside and outside the palace, and all the people follow him. That's why she proved to him that no one would stand in his way, so she had no reason to stay here. Unfortunately, what she said was true. She had blindly followed Sionel since childhood because she loved him, but she only irritated him, and he couldn't drive her away because he considered her capable. Usually, she always followed him, but this time she decided to let go first. Sionel does this because he's stubborn. Our heroine looked at the floor and told Sionel that she noticed and even knew what had irritated him since childhood. Looking at the emperor, or rather at Sionel, her love, she asked if this was what he wanted. She volunteered to leave voluntarily, so she asked him to let her go. Of course, she'll quickly sort things out in return once the contract is fulfilled. Sionel must understand that she. However, she didn't have time to finish her thought, because at that moment, Sionel asked everyone to leave the room and leave them alone. Looking at his face, our heroine realized that today, she could even die by his hand. At that moment, Sionel angrily ordered everyone to get lost. Once everyone left and they were alone in the room, Lindell didn't even know what to do. How could they have abandoned her at such a moment? She was horrified by the increasingly terrifying atmosphere. Was the emperor really angry? She couldn't die by the emperor's hand. The contract would do that. At that moment, Sionel repeated her words in bewilderment. What do you mean her role is over? After all, she made him emperor. Looking at her, he asked if she was really going to leave him at such a moment. Lindell still thought about the fact that she asked to be sent away. Why then did he sound like he was betrayed? Our heroine initially thought the outcome would be that the emperor wouldn't care about her. In her imagination, she imagined such an outcome that Sionel was even pleased, but the emperor suddenly asked if she really would leave her. Why? Was she afraid of him? Lindell looked at him in bewilderment and said that he was mistaken because it was not so. Unexpectedly for our heroine, she saw a tear fall, and raising her head, she saw a crying Sionel, who asked her why she wanted to run away from him so much. He told her she should have told him she was sick right away. She should have asked him to save her. She should have done it. Lindell was horrified to realize she'd hurt Sionel, and he was upset with her. But what was going on? She'd acted so obviously that nearly the entire country knew about her feelings for him. But of course not him. Everyone knows the emperor will never open his heart. More likely, he was pushing her away, as if he wanted a relationship with the knights, not with Lindell. So she figured that if he didn't cling to her, she'd leave. Why was he crying then? At that moment, the guy sat down on his knees and turned to our heroine. Taking her hands, he began to ask her not to leave him, and to always be near Lindell, felt his hands tremble. With tears in his eyes, he continued to ask her to say as usual, with a shameless face, that she loved him. Our heroine certainly didn't particularly consider him a man who cleaned out his entourage and became emperor. Sionel told her to ask him for help, and that's why he wanted her to promise him to stay here. Our heroine looked away and told the emperor that this was impossible. The guy let go of her hand and asked why the girl told him only one thing. He doesn't love her. She turned her head again and told the emperor that it was not his fault, but he would definitely have problems if she stayed around. Once again, she reminded him, as always, that she irritated him and how he hated her. So she does not understand at all why Sionel is doing this. Each of these words struck a nerve. Soon the boy lowered his head guiltily. She'd finally told everything, so she wondered if that would be enough. At that point, she decided to add something else. However, what a shock it was when, unexpectedly for her, Sionel interrupted her with his loud laughter. Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment, unable to understand why the hell he was even laughing. Had he gone crazy? The guy suddenly stopped and asked if she really thought he hated her. He sighed and said that it didn't matter to him. She could blame him for everything, even curse him every day, but just not leave. He hugged her tightly again. Our heroine didn't understand what was happening and wanted to tell him something, but he interrupted her and said that he wouldn't let her go. Lindell was completely stumped, unable to understand what was happening and why the emperor was acting this way. She hoped he would easily agree, but once again he interrupted her thoughts, because at that very moment he whispered to her that he loved her. Our heroine was confused. What? Had she misheard? She didn't even know where to look. Why did Sionel say that? Soon he came up to her, and said that he understood that it was useless to say this now, and he knew that he would not be able to keep her with such words. Lindell, however, pulled back at that moment and asked them to wait and first explain who loved whom, the Emperor. Her? The guy looked away, embarrassed, and said that she had heard everything correctly. It was like fireworks went off in Lindell's head. What can I say? Congratulations! Lindell's love is no longer unrequited. It's crazy! Now she could no longer believe that the magnificent Cyanil loved her. Was that even possible? She remembered how everyone laughed at her feelings for him. But look at her now, you idiots. Dreams come true. Lindell was incredibly touched and asked again if Cyanil really loved her. The guy, surprised, asked if she really didn't like it so much that it made her shudder. He understood that such sudden words were hard to believe. Lindell was only thinking that she had enjoyed everything so much that she hadn't even had time to assess the situation. Suddenly, the girl realized something. If the Emperor's words were true, then what would happen to her wish? Literally, the reason she got into all this was because she thought Cyanil hated her. Cyanil suddenly told her she didn't have to believe his words, since it was his own fault. Our heroine, however, stopped him and said she believed him. However, the exciting news didn't end there. The Emperor told her at that moment that she would soon become Empress. Impera? What? Our heroine was in complete shock. What on earth did he do? Coming closer to Lindell, he told her that she would be his Empress, and that was why she would not go anywhere. He said that now she would always be by his side, and he would be by her side. Lindell thought about it. She loved Cyanil, of course, but she was still absolutely certain he'd completely lost his mind. The girl, perplexed, told him that she didn't believe what he had just said. The boy nevertheless told her that everything had already been decided, but she still said that wasn't it, and that His Majesty couldn't decide such a matter alone, so the nobles would be against it. She assured him that if he made the Count's illegitimate daughter Empress, there would be no end to the scandals. This was definitely not his style of rule. Cyanil nevertheless told her with absolute confidence that he was choosing his wife, so who would dare to stop him? Lindell cried out again, but Cyanil decided to remind her that everything had already been decided, so nothing would change. Our heroine was shocked that he decided to make her not just a concubine, but an empress. She possesses great power, as she is the only person on par with the Emperor. However, the responsibility befitting such a high rank is also there. It would be a lie to say that nobles only revel in power and eat well. She understands well the amount of work that lies ahead. And again, she loves Cyanil, but she never thought of becoming empress. She always wanted a comfortable life and fun. Even the life of a knight is exhausting, and he's asking her to work for the Empire until she's old age. No, that's not even what matters right now. She still needs to leave the palace and find the dragon's body to fulfill the contract. If she fails, she will truly die. Lindell didn't want to let this happen after this news. The girl suddenly screamed, saying she didn't want to become empress. Cyanil, of course, was surprised by her words, but said that she still had no choice, even if she was so disgusted to be near him. Our heroine told him that she didn't mean it that way, but he looked at her and advised her to forget about thoughts of running away and dying alone, because he wouldn't let that happen. The girl could no longer control her emotions. It all seemed almost absurd. She repeated that she wasn't dying. The Emperor sighed heavily, but soon headed for the exit, saying that the conversation was over, and that she might consider him selfish, but he could not let her go. Already opening the door of the room, he turned to her and said that she would become empress even if she began to hate him. Immediately after these words, he slammed the door with all his might and left. Lindell could only collapse in bewilderment at this whole conversation. Everything had become even more confusing due to the misunderstanding. What should she do now? If this continues, she'll actually die. The girl started going crazy and hitting pillows. At that moment, a certain energy passed, Lindell suggesting her plan had failed. Our heroine looked back, having heard Larocque's voice. When had she arrived? In response to the spirit's words, she threw a pillow at it, saying it all started because of her. Larocque was surprised and said she didn't know what happened, but throwing pillows wasn't appropriate. Our heroine started screaming anyway, asking her to cancel the contract. Larocque said she couldn't go back on her word like that after signing the contract, but Lindell replied that it was force majeure. After some time, Larocque learned everything and, perplexed, decided to ask if she understood correctly that the problem was that the emperor loved her. Was that really so bad? The girl said she wouldn't be able to fulfill her part of the contract if he remained like this. Sionel simply wouldn't let her leave the palace. Larocque was surprised. She advised them to escape secretly, then find the body, break the seal, and finally return. It wouldn't be that difficult. Lindell, however, said she couldn't just leave. Unfortunately, the palace is protected by a powerful family barrier. Even several great wizards couldn't break it. That's why if she tries to get past this barrier, there won't be any bones left of her. Larocque was surprised again. If that was the problem, she said she could easily solve it. Once again, Lindell decided to say that they were in the palace. So with a simple spell, such a thing would not, Larocque sighed, saying that she always underestimated hers. However, she reminded him that she was a dragon, a being known as a master of magic. A simple barrier created by humans simply couldn't stop her. Our heroine decided to remind her that she couldn't even find her body. Larocque responded by saying that the whole situation was a bit unusual. Either way, she asked me to keep a close eye on her. A single movement of the hand would be enough for her. The girl let out a joyful cry and soon snapped her finger. When nothing worked, she decided to snap it again and again and again. Larocque couldn't understand why it wasn't working, and said that couldn't be true. Lindell sighed heavily and told her that she'd already proven the same thing to her. They are in the Imperial Palace, where, by the way, the blood of dragons flowed in the veins of previous emperors. This barrier has been strengthened over generations, and that is why the work of hundreds of years cannot be simply destroyed. Lindell added that magic cannot be used here. Only pure human magic, or the divine power of priests, is permitted. Larocque screamed in confusion and asked what they should do, then if she couldn't escape, she'd be in trouble. Lindell smiled again and said she'd already told her that. Larocque said she felt the emperor wasn't interested in her fate at all. Lindell, perplexed, asked the dragon why she'd suddenly brought him up. Soon they began arguing. After a while, they were lying on the ground. Larocque sighed heavily, saying she couldn't believe she'd chosen such a man. Why was she so unlucky? Unexpectedly, she told Lindell that she believed she had the willpower to live a long life, so why couldn't she convince the emperor? After all, she was the Empire's finest knight. Lindell thanked her for the compliment, but thought about it. It seemed like canceling the contract wasn't an option, but time was running out, and every second and minute counted. She needed to find a solution. At that moment, the girl jumped up, saying they had a contract. Larocque asked what she was talking about. Lindell explained that the contract affects both parties. If you delve into the terms, you can always find a way out. There's a barrier on the palace, but she still managed to get in. If it wasn't magic, then the terms of the contract helped. Larocque said that it was quite possible, and so our heroine immediately stood up, saying that they finally had hope it was time to look for loopholes. The girl suddenly asked if she understood correctly that this required reading the entire contract. In that case, she said it was too long, so she suggested finding another solution. Our heroine was surprised and asked if it could really be that difficult. It was only 13 pages. She asked for the contract and she could look it over herself. Larocque began to hesitate suspiciously and drawl. Lindell asked, surprised, if everything was okay. Was she hiding anything? The girl said she showed her the most important part of the contract, but it's actually longer. There's a little more information there. She justified everything by saying that she didn't want to tire her out, so she decided to deliver the main part. Lindell sighed heavily and asked to see the contract, and right now, Larocque knew she had no other choice, so she instantly snapped her fingers. Immediately after the click, our heroine saw falling leaves, but she soon realized that she had definitely been deceived because the amount was much greater than it seemed at first glance. Larocque immediately laughed and asked how many pages there were. She estimated there were about 1,700. Our heroine sat down on the bed in bewilderment and asked if she had really shown her only 13 pages out of that whole pile. How could she have managed to hide 1,687 pages? Larocque immediately reminded her that she had retrieved the most important part. Lindell angrily squeezed one of the documents, and looking at the dragon, asked if she had any conscience at all. Larocque, horrified, asked the girl to calm down and discuss everything normally, but soon our heroine attacked her. After some time, Lindell finally decided to read the documents, but they seemed endless. Why were there so many conditions? The girl asked, surprised at what point everything had become so complicated. She'd made a mistake when signing the contract, and now it had all come down to this. Either way, the fulfillment of any wish was too tempting an offer. She could break the dragon's seal and gain her freedom. She could ask for anything, and she was thinking about getting help in winning Sinol's heart. Scratching her head, she couldn't even imagine that all this would become just a problem for her. At that moment, Laroque began to lower her hands, but our heroine looked at her angrily and ordered her to keep them raised. The girl apologized, saying that her hands hurt. Lindell, perplexed, asked her how she dared to say that when she knew what the conditions were written in the contract. Whose fault is it that she has to verify so much information? No matter how much she reads, there's no end in sight. She didn't even know whether she would die faster from overwork or from anger at Laroque. The dragon smiled and said she wouldn't die. Lindell said that while this is true, the exhaustion still persists. She's starting to think she won't be able to fulfill the terms of her contract. Nevertheless, she understood that she certainly wasn't going to die. She would definitely find it. At that moment, her face changed. The girl started coughing loudly, and Laroque approached her, immediately perplexed. As it turns out, the side effects have resurfaced again. They've become more frequent. Could it be because of her emotional state? Laroque decided to ask Lindell how she was doing, but at that moment she opened a portal. Lindell asked what it was for, to which she replied that it was because the contract might get dirty. Our heroine, nevertheless, asked whether it was possible to place a person in this space and then take her out of here. Laroque said living creatures weren't allowed in there unless she wanted instant death from ruptured viscera. Our heroine sighed and said she was of no use. Soon the girl looked at her hand and asked how long this cough would last. Laroque replied that she didn't know. This is proof that her body is adapting to fulfill her desire as quickly as possible. You could say the blood is a byproduct of the process. She never would have made a wish if she knew she'd be coughing up blood. Now everyone in the castle thinks she's dying. Incidentally, she mentioned that she even had to clean up, without anyone seeing. Laroque offered to help. But our heroine replied that she could handle it herself. Looking up, she suggested that the dragon quickly sort out the contract and tidy up the room. Lindell also asked that everything be returned to the table as soon as she had collected it all, and most importantly, that not a single page be lost. Laroque asked if she really would read everything. Our heroine sighed heavily and said she had to. Did they really have any other choice? Laroque said she understood, but how could she do it? She smiled in horror and said that she would not sleep at night and then somehow cope when she found something strange in him. While gathering the documents, Laroque told her she would definitely live a long life. Our heroine suddenly asked why the contract was appearing so easily now. Laroque smiled and told her that making that mess would have been more impressive. Our heroine smiled and said it was true because she almost fainted. At that moment, the knight called Lady Lindell and said someone had come to see her. Our heroine, perplexed, said she wasn't ready yet. Laroque also mentioned that her room wasn't in particularly good condition. At that moment, a visitor's voice rang out. Lindell realized with horror that it was the commander's voice. The dragon screamed in confusion and asked what they were going to do. Lindell told her to stay calm as she was thinking. Either way, she couldn't understand why the guard commander had arrived so suddenly. In any case, Laroque needed to be driven out first. Just as she was about to say something, our heroine discovered that Laroque had already fled. She was very good at abandoning her. Wait, why did she leave the papers there? Literally anyone who came in would find that suspicious. After some thought, she decided that it would be best to hide them under the bed, since no one would look there. The voice asked Lindell what was going on, and she asked her to wait a little longer, thinking that she needed to change her clothes and put everything else away. In her haste, she decided to jump up, and because of this, she hit her toe with all her force on the corner of the sofa. The girl instantly fell to the ground, thinking about how much her poor finger hurt. Lindell screamed silently and hoped she hadn't broken her finger, but it still hurt unbearably. Why was this happening to her? However, she couldn't hold back her first scream, which is why the bewildered commander of the Shrine Empester Guard burst into the room and asked why she was screaming. Looking around, he was in incredible shock. There was chaos everywhere, documents, a broken vase, blood. What was going on? He soon noticed Lindell lying on the floor, so he ran to her and asked what was wrong. Our heroine looked at him in surprise and asked why he came in. Shrinempester nevertheless began to look at the girl and was shocked by her condition. He hoped this story wouldn't get any worse. At that moment, Lindell grabbed the guard general and told him that everything wasn't as he'd understood it. She asked him to let her explain everything. She immediately said that she hit her foot on the bed, so she asked not to worry about her. Shrinempester looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she was really going to lie to him, so as not to worry him. He instantly jumped up and started asking if there was anyone outside, because Lady Lindell needed a doctor. He had no idea it was so serious. Our heroine was perplexed by everything that was happening. Was everyone here completely insane? She was surrounded by crazy people who didn't understand her. Soon the man looked at Lindell and asked if she was sure everything would be okay without calling a doctor's. Lindell smiled and said she was fine. Nothing would change if the doctor came, and he needed to know. Shrinempester is known for being strict with all knights, so she is surprised by his kind side. Looking at Lindell, the guard commander couldn't understand how damaged she was since she spoke so calmly about everything he knew. She was completely different. So why was it all like this? Lindell, meanwhile, was thinking that healers would only get in her way in her situation, because then Cyanil would come here, and she wouldn't have the courage to withstand another look like that. At that moment, the Shrinempester called Lindell again. Our heroine looked at him in surprise, asking what had happened. She was so lost in thought that she had forgotten he was there. Shrine suddenly lowered his head, thinking that she would not be able to put her thoughts in order. It was for this reason that he asked her to forget about it, and soon said that he had sent a knight for the maid, so she should lie down and rest. He also asked her not to worry as he would help, so he asked her to lean on him. Lindell, perplexed, began to say that she was fine. However, he still lifted her up, and after she started limping, she said that her leg was still shaking because she had hit her toe hard. Lindell could tell from the commander's look that he definitely didn't believe her. He seemed to think she'd treat him better if she pretended not to notice. Soon our heroine sat up on the bed. Shrine suddenly noticed the blood on her clothes. He asked if it was from her coughing and how often this happened. Our heroine sighed in surprise. She'd completely forgotten about it, and now it would be much more difficult to clean nothing but trouble. Anyway, she said it was a first, something she'd never seen before, and that it only looked awful. She decided to dress in dark colors. The Shrinempester, however, told her that she still thought of others first and herself second. It would be better to put herself first this time. Looking around, the commander realized he was too busy to notice. The room was chaos, and Lindell could only have caused something like this if she hadn't been able to control her body. The man also recalled a recent conversation at the door with a knight who asked in surprise what had happened to Lindell since she had already even had His Majesty in. Shrinempester immediately asked in surprise if the Emperor had really been here before him. In that case, he wondered if the Lindell room could have become like this after his visit. He twisted his face aggressively, thinking that Cyanil was going too far. Did he really hate her that much? Lindell didn't even know what the commander was thinking, but she sensed danger. She suddenly mentioned the mess in her room, and that staying there was uncomfortable, so she rearranged her things a bit. The Shrinempester nevertheless asked her to be honest and forthright. He did, however, say she might be upset if he found out she shouldn't know. Our heroine was upset, feeling like she'd lost control of the situation. Why wouldn't anyone help her? They didn't believe a word she said. The girl was wondering what to do now, when suddenly the commander turned to her and asked if she still loved His Majesty. Lindell smiled shyly and nodded. Even in this situation, she felt a thrill when she heard his name. In any case, shortly after she spoke, she said she wasn't the only one who felt this. Shrinempester looked at her in confusion and asked what she was talking about. The girl replied that His Majesty loved her too. Even though she said it, she still couldn't believe it. It was like a dream. She was quite surprised herself, but Cyanil had said so himself when he arrived. She knew the long wait had been worth it. Nevertheless, she asked why the commander had asked. She was still mindful of the fact that she had a 1,700-page audit coming up, and that she had a lot of things to do when she got out. By the way, she understood that if she heard the Emperor's confession after all this, she would also be happy. But what happened to the atmosphere right now? Our heroine soon realized with horror that the commander was alone. Could it be that she had touched him while she was sitting there enjoying herself? She assumed that he was very upset, But soon he turned away, completely showing his sadness. Looking at his tears, she still couldn't understand why he was reacting this way to the fulfillment of his subordinate's dream. His eyes were even bloodshot. She didn't know what to do, and Shreen thought he was the commander, so she couldn't cry. Anyway, Lindell says everything is fine, but in moments like these, aren't you afraid of death? At that moment, our heroine thought, why should she care what the commander thought? If he was jealous, then let him find a mate too. However, at that moment, the maids burst into the room and addressed Lady Lindell. Our heroine jumped in horror at first, but soon noticed it was Luna. Her savior had arrived just in time. However, at that moment, the girl without any words fell to her knees in front of her mistress and began to cry. Lindell asked in surprise why she had suddenly burst into tears. The girl was asking if she had really been so upset that the room had turned into this. With tears in her eyes, she asked what she should do for her beloved and poor Lindell. She said everything was fine, but how could that be true when she was covered in blood again? Our heroine began petting her and asking if she really looked that shocking. In any case, she insisted it was all an exaggeration and that she was fine. Luna couldn't hold back her tears. She jumped up and perplexed asked Lady Lindell why she always said that she knew everything. Our heroine looked at the maid in confusion and asked what she was talking about. The girl then asked her not to think she was an idiot who didn't understand anything. Lindell still didn't understand what her maid meant, because all she did was sleep, eat, and fool around. Luna suddenly said that watching her lie around doing nothing was exhausting. She even thought Lindell was at her limit. Luna continued to say that Lindell was too lazy staring into space and thinking about nothing. She was upset as such behavior was not befitting of unlucky geniuses. Our heroine was surprised that she seemed so lazy. And by the way, when did they even come up with a nickname for her? Lindell was very clear that this nickname was very strange, but in any case, she asked to listen to her at least for a second. Luna screamed again and said that she knew everything, so there was no point in proving anything to her. Our heroine told her she was probably mistaken, but Luna took her hands and asked her to rely on her. Well, here we go again. Lindell had a brilliant plan, but in the end, it seemed like everything only got worse while she did nothing. Luna looked at Lindell for a while and thought that she would always protect her because she would forever remember her on that very day. The action shifts to the past. Entering the room at night, a maid noticed that Lady Lindell was awake, so she offered her a glass of wine if she couldn't sleep. Meanwhile, Lindell looked up thoughtfully and asked if she needed the glass. She didn't even know. Nevertheless, Luna confronted the lady, telling her that her body was already in ill health and that she should sleep. Lindell replied that she wasn't sick and couldn't be. Soon our heroine looked down and said that people always hear only what they want to hear. People don't need the truth. They need what they believe in. It was a pretty stupid decision, but she couldn't blame them. Smiling, she added that it was all her own fault. The maid told her it wasn't true. She didn't know why Lady Lindell was talking about it, but everyone was worried about her. Our heroine told her that she knows that they are good people. And by the way, Luna is also good. She just never thought she'd find someone who cared for her as much as Luna did. She's always grateful for that. That's why she hoped that they would have a long and happy future. Luna looked at Lady Lindell in horror and did not understand whether she was really going to die. Is that why she acts like she's about to leave? She endures the pain so as not to frighten the people around her. Luna hoped the lady would tell her everything. In turn, she could only tell her that she would be fine. Our heroine smiled and said that everything was right. Everything would be just like that, and she would always be there. And once again, the action brings us to the present. Luna couldn't let her mistress go so easily. She had always been kind to her, so she would be there no matter what. The girl suddenly said that Lindell was apparently not moving due to pain and not eating because of a stomachache. She again pretended everything was fine so as not to worry her. Our heroine didn't understand what the maid was talking about. While it was all lazy, what was she supposed to do if she was no longer a knight? And she didn't eat because healthy food was disgusting. Shreen and Pestor joined in the morning and asked in horror if Lindell hadn't eaten because of a stomach ailment. Our heroine screamed and bluntly described the disgusting taste. The guard commander stood by his opinion anyway, so he looked at Lindell in horror and asked how terrible the state of her body was. Lindell knew they didn't believe her. Luna suddenly said she was thinking about her loved ones, and that's why she looked so devastated. Lindell, for her part, wasn't thinking about anything. Meanwhile, the maid continued to complain that Lady Lindell continued to pretend so as not to cause them trouble. No matter how much you try to explain, she came to one possible solution, and that is, send everyone away. Our heroine, after a short pause, apologized and said she wanted to be alone. That's why she asked everyone to leave her room. After a while, our heroine finished taking a bath, and as soon as she lay down on the bed, she only thought about how much better you feel after a bath. There's nothing she can do anyway if this keeps happening. And how did it ever turn into this? Instead of constantly trying to correct the misunderstanding, it would be easier not to explain her condition every time. This meant that the issue of escape had to come first. It was at that moment that the girl remembered the contract. At that very moment, she crawled under the bed. Of course, no one noticed the papers, because she had hidden them in a convenient place. One way or another, you need to read them from time to time, but there are only so many pages here that it's hard to hope for a quick solution. She suddenly wondered if she should talk to Sionel first before leaving. With a heavy sigh, she said she'd do it tomorrow, but she didn't have the strength for today. First, she needed to clearly define her current state. It was also important to decide what to do next, so she decided to read the contract. Thus, the action takes us to the next morning. Having sat in one place all night, our heroine didn't even know how many pages she'd read, though a whole mountain remained. Stretching, she reminded herself that she wouldn't be able to get through all 1,700 pages quickly. In any case, it was already light outside, so it was worth going to Sionel. She'd try to persuade him to let her out of the room, but her face wasn't in the best condition after a sleepless night. They'd definitely get the wrong idea. Although she stood guard all night during national events, it did not create any problems back then. She nevertheless moved forward, thinking that the conversation could not be postponed since the question of the future empress was at stake. Just then, Luna entered the room, apologizing prematurely for the intrusion. However, the first thing Luna said wasn't what she wanted. She cried out in horror and asked what those circles were. Couldn't she have slept? Lindell told her she was a little busy. Luna screamed in horror that she didn't have to do anything. Lindell looked terrible in her opinion. In any case, Lindell said she had something she needed to do, so she suggested they talk about it later. Luna, perplexed, asked the lady where she was going. Knowing there would be no answer, the girl decided to take Lindell if it was urgent. Our heroine understood that if she kept silent, she would at least be able to get out of there. Even before leaving, firstly Luna asked the lady to be careful, and our heroine was surprised by what she saw. In the early days, there were always 2 knights, as is generally accepted, but at what point did there become 3 of them? Luna whispered that His Majesty was angry about Sir Shrane Empestor's visit, so they had reinforced the guard at the northern palace outside. By the way, there were even more knights. Lindell was still curious how the commander had gotten here. It seemed he'd disobeyed the emperor's orders. However, most of the knights respected the commander, so they decided not to interfere. However, at that moment, the knight said that Sir Empestor was now forbidden to visit this place. The guy then decided to ask Lady Lindell how she was feeling. If things were bad, he could call a doctor. Our heroine looked at him and said there was no need for that. All she wanted was to meet His Majesty. The guy said that although he didn't know the reason, it was still impossible to do. He asked her to go back inside. Lindell nevertheless pushed him aside, asking him to get out of the way because her question was urgent. And again, the knight walked around and stood in front of her, saying that he could not let her pass, so he again asked her to go to his room. Our heroine looked at the knight's face with something like disdain. "Just look at this knight!" At that moment, Luna decided to turn to Lady Lindell. Our heroine suddenly realized that things weren't going as she'd hoped. She instantly clutched her heart, thinking that if they wanted to consider her sick, then she would show them what that meant. The girl began to scream in bewilderment and talk about how her heart hurt. The knight immediately ordered the other assistants to call the doctor. Lindell smiled slyly and continued to talk about how her heart ached. All the highest gods had mercy on her because the exit finally opened right in front of her. The girl instantly somersaulted over the knight and soon landed behind him. Lindell immediately started running quickly, and Luna screamed in bewilderment and asked to stop her because she would run away. Our heroine looked around in bewilderment, realizing they were all making noise. If this continued, she would definitely be caught. Yet at that very moment, our heroine managed to bump into someone at such a crucial moment. Who was it? Lindell scratched her head in confusion and wanted to ask why the hell someone was getting in her way, but as soon as she raised her head, she noticed that this obstacle turned out to be none other than His Majesty. Of course, the first thing the Emperor asked was why Lindell was here. Our heroine didn't even know what to do. She was looking for Sionel, but became so flustered as soon as she ran into him, she sheepishly began to say, "His Majesty." The guy looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she was really so disgusted by saying his name. The girl immediately told him that everything was completely wrong and that wasn't the issue. Sionel nevertheless asked the girl what she was doing there. At that very moment, the knights arrived, caught up with Lindell, and upon seeing the Emperor, began to apologize for their mistake. Our heroine understood that this would surely punish the knights, but she couldn't allow it. She instantly embraced Mr. Sionel. The Emperor, perplexed, asked if she had just addressed him by name. The girl smiled nonetheless and said she had been looking for him. Sionel looked at her again in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to believe her words. It was almost insulting, since he'd likely consider her a liar for the rest of his days. She'd finally gotten her emotions under control, so she had to speak carefully. She couldn't let the innocent knights and the moon be punished. Our heroine hugged His Majesty even tighter and asked if he didn't believe her. Lindell's aura of sincerity even melted the ice between the knights and Luna. Lindell told Sionel she wanted to see him. He left yesterday but never returned. Our heroine assumed that these words would be enough and that Sionel would not tolerate such an insult. Still, she felt awkward, but curious about what Sionel would say. At that moment, she raised her head and noticed the Emperor's embarrassed smile. Did he really like it? I never thought he could make such a face. Incidentally, he was even more handsome up close. Suddenly, the knights coughed, indicating they were still there. At that moment, the Emperor turned to her and said that he would come more often, but asked her not to leave her room. Lindell didn't understand why he was talking, as if she were trapped in a palace. She wanted to get out of here. Our heroine told him she didn't want to stay inside. She wanted to go outside. However, the Emperor said she couldn't do that. Lindell asked why, to which the Emperor replied that she was no longer the same our heroine, however told him that she was absolutely no different. All this empty talk was incredibly tiring. She couldn't tell him about the contract, but what could she do then? At that moment, Sionel looked at Lindell and told her that she had to understand the reason. Embracing her, the Emperor asked her to return to the room and not continue the argument. Lindell understood that he was trying to appeal to her feelings to convince her, so she decided to do the same. She started talking about how sad and lonely she felt in that room. Every day she felt like her heart was getting worse. She thinks too much when she is alone, and she feels like the world rejects her when no one is around. Sionel continued to hug her and listen attentively. Soon he stood up and said it was his mistake. He turned to her and said he hadn't realized she was having such thoughts. Lindell was incredibly happy that it worked. At that moment, Sionel took her hand and told her she wasn't alone. Soon after, he asked her not to worry, as this wouldn't happen again. Looking at the Emperor, she felt a bad premonition. Just then, Sionel told her she would be moving into his palace. He would make an exception for the future Empress. Our heroine was in incredible shock. She wanted to leave the room, but things only got worse. Lindell began to say that she hadn't quite meant it that way. The guy nevertheless asked her not to worry, because now she wouldn't feel lonely. Now Lindell knew she was finished. She'd literally dug her own grave. If they put her in his room too, it would be harder to escape the palace. By the way, she remembered the question with the Empress, so she decided to tell Sionel that she cannot be Empress. She explained this by saying that she was a former knight and the illegitimate child of a count. She lacked the education of a lady, having been replaced by swordsmanship. That is why she thought that the daughter of a duke or marquise would be more suitable for the position of Empress. The girl began to say that she was not suitable, but at that very moment, one of the knights asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. Lindell noticed it was the general speaking. Where did he even come from? The man was shouting and saying that Lindell was the perfect fit. Only she knows about the loyalty and love with which she served His Majesty, and therefore she is his greatest treasure. Everyone around them also began to say that these were true words, because only Mrs. Lindell would be suitable for the role of Empress. Who else if not her? One of the men even dared to say that they hoped she would become their empress. Lindell couldn't understand where so many nobles came from. Sionel pointed to the nobles and knights and told Lindell that the majority agreed with this decision, so he asked her not to say that she was not suitable for this role. At that moment, Lindell wondered where her doctor was. Was he really not going to say anything? Sionel is too stubborn to give up on the idea of making her empress. If pressuring her feelings doesn't work, then she'll have to move on. At that moment, the emperor took the girl's hand and told her that her hand was cold. He said that the maids would carry her things, so she should go. However, our heroine stepped back, saying that she could not be here. Sionel was still perplexed, so he wanted to ask her why she was saying that, but everyone cried out in confusion, and Sionel ran up to her. Our heroine didn't understand what was happening. Had she overdone it when she hit Sionel's hand? Looking at the ground, she didn't understand what that strange smell of iron was, but it soon became clear that the cause was the blood that had started flowing from her nose again. Everyone screamed and talked about it in horror. People assumed she was bleeding heavily. Lindell's only thought was that now was the wrong time. She'd been sitting over the contract for too long that night. The girl started making excuses for you, saying that everything isn't as it seems. She didn't sleep last night, so she might bleed if she's too tired. She started twirling and telling them not to worry, but soon decided to get back to what they were talking about. Right? The Empress. People, however, were not going to continue this conversation, so everyone immediately started calling for a doctor. Lindell shouted after them, asking them to listen to her. She was perfectly fine, as she had already said. At that very moment, Sionel took our heroine into his arms and asked her to calm down. The girl raised her head and began asking Sionel to lower her to the ground. Nevertheless, the emperor asked her to remain silent and simply hold on to her. He assured her that everything would be fine. All the while, Lindell's blood spilled onto the carpet. Lindell tried to say something, but the emperor kept saying everything would be fine. He promised her that. As a result, after a while, she was lying in Sionel's bedroom. Our heroine had no idea they would go so far. No matter how much she explained to people, they still acted as if she were a patient. Lindell contacted Sionel again and said she was fine. She also assumed that he had a lot of other things to do. So Sionel suddenly interrupted her and asked her not to worry because the healer would arrive soon. All the maids were perplexed and saddened by the fact that Mrs. Lindell, in such a situation, would think of His Majesty first. Lindell, however, merely tried to drive him away. One way or another, the girls whispered to each other what they could do to make her feel better. They agreed that it was best to wait for the healer. Just at that very moment, a healer ran into the room, walking towards Lindell in horror, saying that he would immediately activate the restoration spell. Within a moment, he took her hand and began to whisper a spell to himself to help Lindell. Our heroine sighed heavily because she understood that no matter how many times he read this spell, she would still not be sick. Soon she stood up and asked the healer to take a rest, as this would probably have to be done immediately after arriving. The man leaned over, saying he was flattered that she was thinking about him in her state. But not to worry, she was suffering because of his incompetence. How could she relax? Sionel had been nervously biting his finger the whole time, but soon asked the healer about Lindell's condition. The man told the emperor that he most likely had nothing to worry about, as some of the small veins had weakened due to fatigue. He explained that she would recover once she'd had a good rest. At that moment, Sionel sat down opposite Lindell with a near crash. He didn't understand why she was going outside after she started bleeding from the slightest movement. Sionel assumed she hadn't slept all night. Perhaps she was feeling some discomfort? Lindell told him that wasn't the case at all. She looked away sheepishly and said she'd been having trouble sleeping. Of course, she couldn't tell anyone she'd spent the entire night reading the scammer's contract. Sionel, breathing heavily, asked if it was true. Our heroine looked at him with pity on her face. At that moment, the healer asked the girl if she ever experienced attacks of pain or if she ever felt short of breath. The girl told him that there was no pain in principle, but she was out of breath because she hadn't eaten enough. He asked if she had lost her appetite. Did she often feel dizzy? Did she feel tired? Or maybe her back was tense and her legs weak. Lindell told him it was all true. She wasn't feeling well after vomiting blood, but wasn't the rest just natural when you're lying around all day? She couldn't understand why he was asking this, when suddenly the man said he understood everything. Senel jumped up and asked what he understood. Rising from his seat, he said he thought he'd found the answer to the question of what was ailing Mrs. Lindell. Our heroine didn't understand what he was talking about. At that moment, the healer said she most likely had a soul distortion. To say our heroine was shocked would be an understatement. What does that even mean? He sighed heavily and said that he couldn't even believe that this had happened to her. And what should they do? Lindell was shocked that they believed him. She knew any normal person would say it was just the plot of an old-fashioned novel. Nevertheless, Senel asked what it meant. The healer replied that he would explain everything now Mrs. Lindell had not suffered any serious injuries recently and had not been poisoned. That's why he focused on things whose symptoms manifest over a long period of time. He searched for information in countless books. He finally found a disease with matching symptoms. It was hard to believe at first, but now he's convinced. He sighed heavily again and told the lady that her soul was distorted. Lindell only said to herself that the only thing distorted was his head. Sionel clenched his fist and asked the healer why he had decided so. The man replied that it was a curse. It was she who displayed the symptoms of a person who had long been cursed. Our heroine was incredibly surprised. Her body is reconfigured to fulfill her desires. This process occurs independently of the body's owner's will. In a way, it truly is a curse. She looked at the healer and asked herself if he had really guessed what was happening to her, although he claimed that the curse had been on her for a long time, but the contract was concluded recently. Our heroine became a little overwhelmed at this point and said out loud that it hadn't been that long ago. Silence fell over the room. The girl instantly realized she'd accidentally said all this out loud. The healer immediately assumed Lindell knew the truth. Our heroine, perplexed, asked him what he was talking about. He replied that she had reacted detachedly, as if she knew what was happening to her. She knew she was cursed, and knew what it would lead to. At that moment, Sionel cried out in bewilderment and asked Lindell why she hadn't told him. The healer began to cry and say that she simply could not say it. Lindell was in shock, and looking at the tears of this charlatan, she wanted to shut his mouth. Looking at Sionel, the man said the curse was most likely intended for His Majesty. The culprit had likely tried to curse him even before his coronation. Our heroine completely lost track of what he was saying. How could the curse target Sionel? The man reminded Sionel that he spent a lot of time with Lindell when he was 15. He assumed the boy had felt discomfort or pain, which had quickly disappeared after their first meeting. Sionel, horrified, said that was true. In that case, the man said everything was as expected. She had removed his curse back then. The man began to cry, just like Luna and the other maids. Soon he asked how long she had been protecting His Majesty. Lindell was confused. None of this was true. The cough had nothing to do with Sionel, so why was he taking his grandfather's nonsense seriously? At that very moment, the Emperor fell to his knees and began laughing loudly. Lindell was very surprised. She immediately asked him if everything was okay. Sionel kept his eyes closed and soon told her that everything was clear to him now. He remembers that she always told him that he had a lot of enemies, but even then she told him and promised to protect him at any cost. Lindell said this with a smile on her face. However, recently, she started saying that there were no enemies left, so her role here was over. Could that really be what she meant? Clutching his heart, he asked if she really intended to disappear, taking his curses with her. Did she really think he would be grateful if she died in his place? Lindell was in complete shock. Horrified, she insisted it wasn't true. She didn't understand what to do, or why Sionel had immediately assumed it was true. At this point, Sionel was perplexed, wondering who could have done this. Our heroine, for her part, couldn't understand why he was reacting so strongly to the curse. At this moment, the healer turned to His Majesty and asked if there had been any sorcerers near the former Empress. Let's immediately recall how it all happened. We're talking about the Dowager Empress, the wife of the previous emperor. Sionel wasn't even born to a concubine, but to a common maid. She hated him to death. This woman constantly interfered with him, sent assassins, and did many other bad things. She even used any means necessary to kill Sionel. In any case, she kept the witch by her side, caring for her. The healer meant to say that she had taken upon herself the curse the witch had tried to cast on Sionel. However, she immediately wondered if she had died at the hands of the emperor. At that moment, Cyanil said that he killed the Empress and the sorceress with his own hands. Then why didn't the curse disappear? If it was complete, it wouldn't disappear so easily even after the spell died. His Majesty was the target. The curse must have been powerful, and that's probably why it didn't disappear. Cyanil then said that if they found the culprit, then they could find a treatment. How can they help her? What can they do? The man looked at the Emperor and told him there was only one way: they needed to find the Dark Healer. The Emperor looked at the healer in bewilderment and asked what Dark Healer they were talking about. The man said that beyond the Southern Sea, there was a man who could control souls. Perhaps he could restore a corrupted soul to its normal state. He found only one solution. The Dark Healer could save Mrs. Lindell. Soon after the doctor left Lindell's room, rumors began to spread throughout the empire. The girl who fell in love with the young prince at first sight swore allegiance to him and took away the curse to protect him, and is now dying from it. It's funny this is how the story of the knight who sacrificed himself for the emperor came about. It was distorted and romanticized, which led to further spread of the rumors across the country. Even Luna spoke about these rumors. The knights nearby were crying when suddenly one of them asked Lindell if she was listening. The girl caught herself and said that she was listening. Utilia suddenly invited her to look at the blossoming trees together and eat her favorite dishes when she became healthy again. Roselle, in turn, asked what they could do for Lindell, and Pan asked her to calm down. Lindell herself realized she had so much to consider that she was going crazy. She soon said she was perfectly fine. However, Utilia asked her not to pretend, because everyone already knew the truth. Why did she continue to insist? The girls asked if she knew how surprised they were when they heard about her condition. Lindell looked down guiltily and apologized to the girls. Pan suddenly mentioned that according to rumors, His Majesty was taking good care of her. They thought it would be amazing if she could overcome the curse with the power of love. As soon as she heard the words about Cyanil, she even became a little embarrassed, but his concern had a downside. He takes such good care of her that it's become a problem. 5 days have passed since the healer's delusional story. After this story, the Emperor treats her differently. He thinks she could break at any moment. She was even so bored staying in the room that she even called her friends. At this point, Pan asked in surprise if they could even be in this bedroom. She then added that the room looked like a newlywed's room. Lindell screamed in disbelief and said that it was all a lie. Roselle, nevertheless, began congratulating her friend, as they had heard she would be empress. Utilia was surprised that her efforts and love had finally reached Cyanil. In any case, they were glad that she could become happy, so they asked her not to worry about little things and just get better, and she could also call them if she felt bad. At that moment, Pan said that His Majesty was doing everything to find the Dark Healer. Many knights had set out to search for him. They would certainly upend the entire empire. Lindell was surprised that even the guards had left. The palace couldn't be left unguarded, as there would be no one to protect His Majesty. The girls approached her and said she seemed to be unaware of the gravity of the situation. It was a matter of the health and life of the Empress, the mother of the country. Even the commander of the Shrine Empestor Guard himself led one of the search groups. Pan asked her friend to stop thinking about others and finally focus on herself. Lindell apologized and said she was already thinking about herself. She suggested that it would be better to wait for the Dark Healer to clear up the misunderstanding. Suddenly, Roselle approached Lindell and asked her how she had been able to detect the Emperor's curse. Pan and Utilia said they were also interested. Lindell, perplexed, said there was no curse, that it was all pure nonsense. She'd arrived at the palace at 15, and such a child simply couldn't have noticed the curse. Roselle asked in horror if this was all a lie. Lindell, surprised, asked what she thought about it. Utilia, however, explained that she was the Emperor's personal knight, so she couldn't be told the secret. Pan even felt sad that she was keeping it from them. Lindell screamed in disbelief and said that if they weren't going to believe her, they didn't have to ask. Just then, Luna walked into the room and asked if she needed anything. The maid, in turn, noticed a very interesting scene. Lindell screamed in anger and ordered everyone to get out of her room. As soon as she noticed her faithful servant, her face instantly changed, and she said that she had come just in time. Since there were 3 knights there who were bothering her, she asked them to be sent away. A moment later, Pan, Roselle, and Utilia were standing outside the door. Utilia sank to the ground, saying that Lindell might be pretending, but the video showed her in terrible condition. It was impossible to believe she was okay. Lindell often missed attacks she could have easily dodged before. It was as if she felt pain. Lindell, who had always been ahead of them in everything, had changed so drastically. They were closest, but they didn't notice. Roselle continued to cry and ask what they would do if she died. Utilia screamed in confusion and begged them not to talk nonsense. Even she started to cry at that moment, but she still said that Lindell would never die. The action shifts to the evening of the same day. Our heroine is still lying on the bed, and Cyanil is looking through documents. He suddenly suggested that she couldn't sleep. Could it really be the same? Apparently, she was tired of constantly meeting guests. If something was wrong, he asked that they speak up immediately, as soon as problems arose, and that nothing be hidden from him. He also asked that they not bear the burden alone. Our heroine said she was upset that he came home every evening just to work. She would like to spend more time with him. As soon as he heard the talk of a possible breakup, he said it was nonsense. It would never happen because he would cure her. Our heroine realized she'd started complaining without even realizing it, but perhaps she'd gotten used to being around him. Either way, she said she hadn't been sick from the start. She suddenly said she'd heard that Cyanil was actually looking for the Dark Healer. Had he really even sent the guard commander to search for him? Cyanil assumed her visitors had told her this. He said it was true, after all. No one could handle it better than the guards. They're responsible for her safety one way or another, so sending them away for such trivial matters wouldn't be right. She might not have many enemies right now, but he asked if she was really that worried about him. Our heroine was surprised by this question. Lindell soon told him that this was natural, since she was a knight of the Emperor and vice commander of the guard. Yet at that moment, he hovered over her and asked if that was really the only reason she loved him, didn't she? Cyanil smiled slyly, because he knew her answer, and also knew about his feelings for her. Our heroine was incredibly confused. She didn't know what to do. They were always together, but now the atmosphere was completely different. Her heart kept pounding loudly. One way or another, she couldn't help but tell Cyanil that he was right. He was very handsome. Soon, he lay down next to her and said that the imperial family had plenty of handsome men. Lindell in turn said that he was the best, and no one could compare to him. He said he didn't even know whether he liked it or not. He asked if he understood correctly that she was only attracted to his appearance. The girl said she was the Count's illegitimate daughter, so she thought they looked alike. At first, she thought that was why she couldn't take her eyes off him. However, at some point, she began to feel completely different, and she doesn't know why. She explained it by saying she simply loved him. The girl then asked Cyanil why he fell in love with her, to which he smiled and said that it was a very good question. Lindell asked, perplexed, if he really wouldn't tell. How cruel. He'd forced her to tell everything. With a heavy sigh, she said it didn't matter. As they say, if you fall in love first, you lose. She'd sleep since he wasn't going to talk because she was tired. Yet at that moment, Cyanil began to reach out to her and think that she still didn't understand. In this life or any other, he would always love her first. The action moves forward some time. Our heroine realized that everyone in the Imperial Palace was busy with something. When everyone around her is working, she even starts to feel like she has plenty of time, although she's busy in her own way. No matter how much she reads the contract, it never ends. What's more important is that Larocque says nothing at all after appearing. Did something really happen? At that moment, the girl turned to Lindell and told her that she would be gone for a while. Our heroine immediately stood up and asked what this meant. What was the reason? Why so suddenly? Where to? And what would they do with the loopholes? Larocque told her that she had urgent business, and she didn't want to leave her, but it was important. Still, our heroine was perplexed, asking where she was going to go alone with her incomplete body. After all, she herself had said it was made of mana. Larocque told her that she was still a dragon, even if she appeared before Lindell in this form. That's why she said that wasn't the problem. Lindell apologized and said she was worried about her. The girl said she understood her intentions and asked him not to apologize. In fact, it was her fault for leaving her, since they had little time as it was. Lindell also noted that time was indeed tight. She didn't know what had happened, but was it really that important to leave at such a moment? Our heroine signed a contract and promised to find the body to remove the seal. Months of searching throughout the empire yielded no results, so other countries remained. Lindell, however, I didn't think she'd be locked in the palace, and they only have 6 months. At this rate, if she doesn't fulfill the contract, she'll simply die. She also decided to remind them that Larocque's shell would run out of power and disappear immediately. Couldn't they leave after they found a way out of the palace? The girl apologized and said it absolutely had to be done now. She couldn't reveal the reason, but she wanted to check one thing and would be back soon. Lindell sighed heavily, but still accepted her words. So if it was that important, then she could go. At that very moment, Larocque looked at our heroine in bewilderment and asked if she really could go. Lindell told her she wasn't going on her final journey, so yes, she could go. And anyway, why bother asking her if Larocque had made it clear she was leaving anyway? Larocque asked in surprise what would happen if she was late or didn't return. Our heroine considered this, but soon said there would only be one option. They will die together and soon walk hand in hand into the afterlife. The girl sighed and said that she sometimes forgets what kind of person Lindell is. Regardless, our heroine still told her she'd return. Larocque asked if she believed her. Our heroine, surprised, asked who else she could trust if not her. In that case, Larocque decided she had to return. She soon thanked her for her understanding and promised she would definitely do it. Our heroine told her to act quickly, and she would look for ways to escape. At that moment, Larocque snapped her fingers and said that while she was not here, she would give her one thing. Showing her the bottle, she said it was Estelle, a precious medicine that only dragonkind could prepare. It should be consumed if any problem arose. Our heroine asked in surprise if she really meant that the side effects would get worse. Larocque said she only gives it as a precaution. Lindell then asked for clarification on what problems she should take it for. The girl said that she needed to think a little, and soon she smiled and said that she needed to take the medicine when it seemed like she was dying. Our heroine was in incredible shock. The dragon in turn began to laugh and say she was joking. If she feels strong changes due to the contract, for example bleeding, then she needs to drink it, and it will balance all the processes in the body. Lindell asked why she hadn't given it to her, before Larocque explained that it was difficult to make. Since it was sealed, she had to ask a friend to help her prepare it. Our heroine decided in any case that if it was so valuable, it was best to drink it right away. However, Larocque began to stop her. She was perplexed and said that this was a dragon medicine that could cause side effects in humans. In that case, Lindell asked why she needed to give it to her. Larocque sighed and said she'd warned her to only take it in emergency situations. Lindell suggested that in that case, she'd have to drink only when something serious happened. Larocque stood up, saying she hoped that wouldn't happen. Soon after, she opened the window and said she was leaving. However, she decided to say one last thing. Smiling, she said confidentially that it would be okay if the contract was a little delayed. Lindell recalled that she told her she would die if they didn't complete the contract on time. The girl said this motivated her not to waste time. Lindell screamed, saying she was deceiving her again and again. Nevertheless, Larocque jumped down and said they'd see each other later. Our heroine only screamed in bewilderment at the end and said that she was a fraud. Several days had passed since Larocque's departure. Our heroine still hadn't figured out how to find her body. What was the best thing to do? At that very moment, Lindell was pulled out of her thoughts by her faithful servant Luna. Our heroine instantly came to her senses and asked what they were talking about. The girl said they were talking about founding an empire. The sky was clear, which meant the stars would be more visible on the night of Jersila. Lindell sighed and said she remembered. However, what really bothered her was that Larocque had left in a temporary body. Although then she wondered if she should even worry about this swindler. After all, she was the kind of person who would always be fine. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. All these hardships she'd been through. Luna suddenly asked the lady if she was in any pain. Our heroine, with incredible anger on her face, said she didn't feel any pain. Luna, horrified, said it was written all over her face, so she was calling a healer. Lindell's expression immediately changed, because there was no need to call him. She was just a little tired. Another meeting like that, and she'd develop ailments she never had before. However, at that very moment, Luna began to cry because her mistress was tired of doing nothing and lying around. At such moments, our heroine couldn't quite figure out whether Luna loved her or hated her. Either way, the girl said she needed to see a healer. Soon, she asked him not to worry about him, as her body was more important. She headed for the door at lightning speed, and our heroine didn't even have time to say anything. Scratching her head, the girl decided that now was not the time to worry about Larocque. It was far better to take care of herself. A moment later, a healer burst into the room, asking Lady Lindell what was wrong. Meanwhile, Luna and the maids were in tears. Our heroine couldn't understand how he'd appeared so quickly, since Luna had only just left. Anyway, she'd said there was no need for him to come. He'd asked her how her head was. The girl, perplexed, said for the 100th time that she was completely fine. The man asked her not to worry because she was so worried about him, so he would help her even at the cost of his existence. And again, the man asked how her head was. Our heroine, in turn, was thinking that she would need to talk to Cyanil about switching healers for another one immediately upon his arrival. The man looked at Lady Lindell and asked her not to hide the pain so that he could find a solution. The girl continued to say that she was not sick and that Luna had thrown a tantrum for no reason. The healer asked in surprise if she was sure she wasn't in pain. He suddenly suggested that perhaps she simply didn't feel the pain. Our heroine looked at him in confusion and asked what he had just said. The man said he doubted she could feel pain, since she always said she wasn't in pain. Soon he turned around and said with tears in his eyes that now everything was clear to him. Lindell, perplexed, told them to wait, because she hadn't said anything yet. The maid approached the healer and asked if he really meant to say that. The man interrupted her and said that seriously, ill people sometimes feel too much pain. He has even encountered cases where patients stop feeling pain altogether, as signals are sent to the brain that are uncontrollably blocked. Soul distortion is inevitably accompanied by intense pain. The curse has spread significantly, so he believes Lindell has achieved this. He assured her that she didn't understand, because she thought everything was fine. Luna also began to say that she now understood why Lindell had said she was healthy. Lindell held back the last of her nervous system, lest she tear this old fox to shreds. She wouldn't let this go that easily anyway. Taking the girl's hand, he told her they shouldn't shake like that. She might not feel it, but that was further proof he was right. The girl screamed loudly and asked how long he would continue to talk this nonsense. She shouted and proudly said that she was a knight. She was the vice commander of the Emperor's elite guard. She certainly understands her own body much better than others, or do they think she's lying? The man, perplexed, began to tell Lady Lindell that he did not mean to say that she was lying, but that he simply wanted her to. In that case, she told him to believe it. He literally doesn't believe anything she tells him. She decided to suggest that in order to check whether she felt pain or not, it would be enough to simply apply force to her body to understand this. The healer, perplexed, asked how he could harm the future empress. The maid also begged Lady Lindell to reconsider. Our heroine, in turn, said that she was still a Bodebachne, not an empress. This was all just a healing process, and the responsibility would rest solely with her. The man sat down on his knees, and even reluctantly, nevertheless agreed with Lindell's words. He took her hand and said he would hold it and squeeze it. If she felt any pain, she should tell him immediately. She looked at him with hawk eyes, thinking that this old man had only made the misunderstanding worse with his arguments, so she would get rid of everything in one go. At that moment, the man said that everything he said was true. He knew it. Could it be that she couldn't see it now? He showed her that he was pressing with all his might, and she didn't even say a word to him. Our heroine, perplexed, asked what he was talking about. What did he mean? He's pressing? Looking at him, she noticed he was shaking with tension. Lindell was shocked. Was he a baby bird or something? Even he would have been stronger. It was immediately obvious he was someone who had never held a sword. The girl screamed and told him to stop joking and start squeezing properly. The man, perplexed, told Lady Lindell that he was already trying. The maid almost fainted at that moment. How could this be? The healer's words had proven true. Our heroine sighed heavily and still insisted it was all a lie. Pointing at the man, she said he had the tenacity of a baby bird. The man asked her to stop being hysterical and just acknowledge his words. If she continued to be angry, it would only get worse. Lindell grew increasingly aggressive. With each word, Luna began to calm her down, but our heroine begged him to let her go, so she could just talk. The healer said that he didn't think they had much time left given her condition, so they needed to find a dark healer quickly. Luna begged our heroine to calm down, as she'd only get worse if she continued to be angry. Lindell thought she'd be angry. She just didn't understand why all this was happening. Soon after, the girl jumped up and ran as fast as she could from this madhouse. Everyone was starting to irritate her too much. A couple of seconds later, she was already running through the corridors of the palace, and knights were shouting after her and asking her to stop. Lindell continued to run as fast as she could and showed no sign of stopping, so she advised the knights not to run after her and just leave her alone. After some time, the girl was finally able to break away and hide behind a column to catch her breath. She sat on the floor in shock. It was enough to drive her crazy. She didn't even really want to run away, but this atmosphere was driving her crazy. She immediately thought about it. Would they report this to Cyanol? What should she do now? She wouldn't be able to leave the palace anyway. Lindell decided she needed to come up with an excuse if she had to go back. At that moment, someone approached her and, surprised, said they knew her. The fair-haired man looked at Lindell in confusion and asked why she was there. The girl, incidentally, was also surprised to meet the young gentleman here. This guy is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, a man from the Emperor's faction, and her half-brother. She definitely didn't want to meet him in a situation like this. This blonde guy's name was Askal. However, our heroine didn't understand where he came from. He should be in another country. At that moment, Askal also asked why she was here. Judging by her appearance, he assumed she'd run away. What on earth was going on? Our heroine immediately noticed the cold, unfeeling tone. It's hard to call them brother and sister, since they're essentially linked only by their last name. His eyes reflect only the fact that she's bringing shame on the family with this appearance. Even if Cyanol wants to make her empress, it does not change the fact that she is still an illegitimate daughter. Tomorrow, rumors will spread throughout the palace that the future empress is running around like a madwoman. This will be a scandal for her family, and yet another embarrassment for him. Making excuses would only make things worse, so it was better to end it with an apology. That's why she looked at him and apologized. Askal said she usually didn't run away so easily. Apparently, she was really going through a rough time. In any case, he decided he wouldn't ask her any questions. Soon after, he put his arm around his sister and asked her to stop sitting on the cold floor and instead lean on him. After lifting her to her feet, he asked her to shift the weight onto him so her legs wouldn't tire. Lindell, perplexed, began to apologize. Askal told his sister there was no need to apologize so much. If the emperor found out about this, he would be worried. He then said that the family, even the father, were also searching for the Dark Healer. So many resources had been invested that they couldn't help but find him. Lindell couldn't believe that the Count, or rather her father, a man who didn't care about her, had suddenly decided to help with the search. Askal, still without emotion, said that everything was just like that, and therefore asked her not to worry, but rather to focus on recovery. Our heroine was very surprised that even he was worried about her. But why? At this point, the guy said that their conversation had gone on too long, so he offered to go and take her back. Lindell couldn't bear to let him take her, so she said she could go herself. Anyway, Askal told her that there was no reason to refuse, so he asked her to stop being stubborn when her body was in such a state. And who wouldn't refuse in such a situation? It would look like she ran away and caused trouble, and he caught her and brought her back. She was sure that if she went with him, she would be disgraced. A civil servant had caught the vice commander of the guard. It would have been better if she had come crawling herself. The girl nevertheless decided that she had to refuse this offer, and if it didn't work out, she would run away. At that moment, for some reason, her head began to spin, but she had to go. A moment later, she fell to the ground, and Askal caught her, and perplexed began asking what had happened. Soon, he tried for a long time to wake her up by shouting her name and shaking her from side to side. After some time, our heroine finally began to come to her senses, but she didn't quite understand what this place was. She saw Larocque and Cyanol before her. At that moment, the girl asked His Majesty why he was so impudent, because if you think about it, she was his ancestor. The guy said she was talking nonsense again. Now was definitely not the time for such nonsense. Nevertheless, Askal sighed and asked them both to calm down. Lindell couldn't tell if this was a dream or reality. Even her brother was here. She didn't understand why they had all gathered in this place, And what was even stranger was that this unfamiliar child was standing next to her. However, at this moment, Askal was talking about his sister being in bad condition, but unexpectedly noticed that she had already come to her senses. After these words, the emperor approached her and ordered the boy to step aside. Askal also joined in and said that he would also ask to move away from his sister since she had woken up. At that very moment, the guy ran up to the girl and said that they had been making fun of him all this time. Lindell, perplexed, told Cyanal that it was a child, so there was no need to press him. The emperor, surprised, asked who had even said it was a child. Our heroine looked at him in surprise and said that everything seemed clear, didn't it? The emperor sighed heavily, asking her how she could have seen such a thing, and again he advised the boy to move away from Lindell. The girl, however, only looked at Cyanal and thought that she had not seen him so irritated for a long time. At that very moment, an interesting thought occurred to her. What if he was just jealous? She immediately decided it was true. He was jealous of her, even when she had a small child, which meant Sunel had a sweet side. The emperor turned to the girl and asked her to look again more carefully. Did she really think it was a child? Our heroine still didn't understand what he was talking about. Looking at the guy, she said that no matter how you looked at him, he... For a moment, she cried out in surprise, asking them where this lout had come from. The guy, surprised, asked Lindell if she really didn't know him. At that moment, the guy simply smiled and began to say who it was. At the same time, an unknown voice addressed her, asking her to wake up. Lindell looked at him and asked what he had just said. She was sure she had heard a voice. The stranger continued to ask Lindell to wake up. The boy snorted, saying how annoying it was. However, the voice continued. At that moment, the guy sighed heavily and said that apparently nothing could be done, so she better go since he was calling her. Lindell didn't understand what this meant. He calmly answered you that they would still see each other again, even if she didn't want to. That's why he told her to go, and that they would see each other later. At that moment, a bright light appeared in front of Lindell. After some time, her eyes opened, and in front of her, she saw a frightened Cyanal who was calling her. Our heroine asked in surprise if it was him. The emperor touched her face and said, "It's him, he's here." Lindell couldn't understand why his hands were shaking so much. And overall, she looked around and couldn't figure out where the person who had been here had gone. When had so many people managed to gather around? The girl looked at the emperor and asked what this place was. Cyanal took her hand and said it was the Root Temple. Our heroine was in incredible shock. She immediately remembered that Ryut is the god of the dead. Again, she didn't understand why she was here, but her last memory was of talking to Brother Askal. Cyanal, the dragon, the man in black, who pretended to be a child. Was it all a dream? She seemed to have lost consciousness, so they brought her here for treatment. Either way, she didn't understand why they had come here, and not to the temple of Ursila, the god of life. Most of the healers who performed the treatments came from there. Our heroine glanced at the emperor and asked him why they were there. He immediately looked down guiltily. He soon told her that it was because she had stopped breathing. Lindell, perplexed, asked what that meant. She couldn't believe it and thought it simply couldn't be true. At that moment, the priests told her that her soul had only recently found peace. Lindell began shouting in anger, asking why they were talking about someone else's soul again. Was that healer Rook up to something again? The emperor said that wasn't true because the healer couldn't do anything else for her. So she asked who had spoken this nonsense. She wanted to know who did it, and then she'd set him straight. At that moment, Cyanal hugged her and asked her to calm down. Lindell spoke of how she couldn't believe everything that was happening. She understood when he was worried, when she caught her breath. But coming to the Loot Temple for such a stupid reason was too much. Cyanal pulled away from her in disbelief and told her that her so-called briefly had turned into 3 days. She hadn't breathed for about 3 days. Our heroine was horrified that all this hadn't lasted a few seconds. Meanwhile, the emperor was asking her what else he could have done. With tears in his eyes, he asked if she was really suggesting that he do nothing when she had even stopped breathing. Our heroine was in incredible shock. She couldn't understand how anyone could hold their breath for 3 days. She immediately assumed that she was not at the Root Temple to come back to life. At that moment, Lindell asked Cyanal, in surprise, if she understood correctly that today was her funeral, and that was why everyone had gathered. Cyanal immediately ordered her to repeat what she had said. The girl apologized, saying she had misspoke. He told her not to say such a thing, even jokingly. Lindell agreed with him and apologized. At that very moment, a joyful man entered the room, saying that she had finally woken up. The girl didn't understand who it was, but from the reaction of the priests, and from Sinel's look, it was clear that they were not at all happy to see him. After grabbing Lindell, he told her that the reward for this deed would be given in full. The boy bowed, repeating his words. Just think, a reward from the emperor! What a blessing to be granted such an honor! Soon after this, the boy turned to His Majesty and reminded him that he had revived her. That's why he was surprised, and asked why he had such a cold reaction to him. Sionel shouted angrily and ordered them to stop talking nonsense. Lindell guessed they were afraid of her. The guy shrugged his shoulders in surprise and asked if he had made some kind of mistake. The emperor told him that he would stay here despite his absurd behavior because he had saved his woman. Either way, he told him not to even dream of a second time. He wouldn't forgive any more disrespect. Lindell was surprised that the man had saved her. Looking at this guy, she assumed he was the Dark Healer. At that moment, even he admitted he'd gone a bit too far. He also took a step toward the emperor and said that he understood that he wasn't happy about this, but still, didn't he really need his help? No one knew when she might get worse again. The emperor said the order could change. If she died first, he would go after her, so he ordered that this insolent attitude be corrected if one wanted to live. The boy clutched his neck in horror, expressing how scared he was. Why was the emperor so cruel? Anyway, he told Sionel that he was surrounded by only stupid priests, which is why they came to him. Our heroine looked at him confused, but she knew one thing for sure. This guy was crazy to be so brazen with Sionel. At this point, he sat down next to Lady Lindell, saying that he had never gotten around to introducing himself. The guy immediately pulled down his hood after these words, saying that he was Lute's servant, Melaine Croston. Lindell, though she could smell madness, still decided she owed him a debt of gratitude. She sheepishly said she was grateful for his rescue. Still, she thought about it, Servant Lute. That's what priests usually say, though she thought only healers could heal. Lindell asked if he'd healed her to revive her. He said he, like other priests, couldn't use such power. It was the domain of healers. In that case, she assumed the Dark Healer was someone else. Melaine sighed and said it was true. He wasn't the person she was looking for. However, at that moment, Sinel looked at Melaine and said only one word to him. Hood? The guy asked what it was for, to which Sinel replied that if he didn't want to die, he'd better quickly put it back on and not show his face in front of Lindell. The guy smiled and said that if His Majesty the Emperor said so, then he agreed. Lindell, for her part, decided she needed to defuse the situation. She suggested that the priest had saved her. Sionel told her that she had stopped breathing, so they didn't have time to wait for the Dark Healer. Unfortunately, the healers in the palace were also powerless, and he thought it would be better to borrow the power of Lute, which was closely connected to the soul. When he arrived, he saw this man. A man with abilities similar to the Dark Healer, and they suited her case. Our heroine asked in surprise what this meant. So from the Emperor's words, Melaine could touch her soul? The boy smiled and said that the power of God he possessed could hold a soul. She had been brought here when her soul and body were separated, so she had stopped breathing. Our heroine, however, couldn't understand how this could have happened. At that moment, she became thoughtful. The problem Larocque mentioned was apparently related to this, an urgent situation with a death threat. Our heroine was furious. She should have expressed herself more clearly. How could she take the medicine if she couldn't breathe? Either way, Melaine rose to his feet and told her that the only thing that mattered was that she was alive now. However, her soul hadn't fully returned, so she couldn't relax. Leaning towards her, he said that it would be better to use his powers again since she had woken up. In that case, he said that everyone except Lady Lindell should leave the room. Sionel looked at the boy and said he hoped he wouldn't do anything stupid. Lindell, perplexed, asked Sionel if he was really going to leave her there. The guy said that he would wait for her outside, and he would come if something happened, so she shouldn't worry. After a while, everyone left the room. Melaine guessed that His Majesty valued her more than he thought. Either way, there was nothing he could do when her life was at stake. Lindell asked him to stop talking nonsense and start treatment as soon as possible. The girl thought that she couldn't give in to this guy's manipulation, so she would pretend that everything was fine. However, at that moment, Mullane took off his hood and asked Lindell how the Emperor would react if he found out that his darling was not human at all. Our heroine, perplexed, asked why he suddenly started talking like that, but unexpectedly for her, he grabbed her by the neck. Mullane looked at her in surprise and asked if she was still pretending not to know anything. Lindell, horrified, asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about, to which the guy replied that an ordinary person could not survive after the separation of the soul. Still holding her by the neck, he told her that she had lasted 3 days, even though her soul was not here. It was impossible. The girl felt like she was starting to run out of air, but at that moment, Mullane said something even more shocking. The boy looked at her and said he smelled a familiar scent. That alone made him think she was a dragon. Our heroine didn't understand what he was even saying. Why was he calling her a dragon? What nonsense was this? Lindell asked him not to talk nonsense because there was no way she could be a dragon. Mullane continued to hold her and advise her to stop playing around. It was no use pretending she wasn't a dragon. He assumed she'd mingled with the crowd, but had been unlucky enough to catch his eye. Too bad. At that very moment, our heroine noticed that his eyes had changed, and she did not understand when he had done it. Soon after, she remembered that Larocque was doing the same. Are they somehow connected? The girl began to say in a hoarse voice that with eyes like those, he was a dragon himself. However, she couldn't breathe, so that's probably how she would die. The guy told her that even dragons fight for survival when it comes time to die. But it's useless. All the people outside don't know what's going on inside. He's blocked the door with magic so they can't get in. He smiled and said that they could only do this after her death. Either way, he was surprised by how little resistance she offered. He soon let go, and she fell to the floor. He asked in surprise if she really didn't have the strength to resist. There was a faint scent. But what had happened? Could it be the soul separation? So the heroine had no idea what this idiot was talking about. Mullane suddenly said that she really did seem weak. Either way, he grabbed her face and began asking how this could be. He wanted to know the reason Lindell, however, didn't know the reason herself. The guy told her that if she can take the form of a human, then she is definitely not a cub. But why then is she so weak? Our heroine was incredibly surprised. How could he mistake an ordinary person for a dragon? What did he expect to see in her then? The girl pulled away from him and said the reason was too obvious. She wasn't a dragon, but an ordinary person. Nevertheless, Mullane asked in surprise why she was left alone. If she was so weak, then her mother shouldn't have abandoned her. Lindell screamed because no one was listening to her. She said again that she was human, but Mullane told her that he would not fall for those words, so our heroine screamed again and told him to listen carefully. She didn't have the mother he was talking about, and she didn't have any family looking out for her. She said that she didn't understand why he wanted to kill her, but nevertheless, she herself was not going to die obediently. Mullane still couldn't understand how this could be. Even if she didn't have parents, someone else would have taken care of them. It was a fact that dragons were selfish, but they cared deeply for those close to them. The girl started saying again that this was exactly why she said she wasn't a dragon. Suddenly, she started coughing, and Mullane asked if she was okay. Lindell covered her nose with her hand and asked him to stop repeating the same thing. He repeated that she smelled familiar and was talking nonsense she couldn't understand. The boy looked at her in bewilderment and asked where he got all this blood from. Could this also be due to the soul separation? Lindell, meanwhile, wiped her face and continued to repeat that she was an ordinary person and dragons could not look after her. Mullane looked down at that moment devastated and asked her if she had been abandoned just like him. With each word he said, the girl became increasingly confused about what this idiot was saying. Was he really talking to her? In any case, he took her hand and said that apparently she had been driven to such a trick by the dragon. Our heroine sighed and said it was true. The strange body behavior had started after she signed a contract with Larocque, so it was indeed the dragon's fault. Mullane was very upset that she had been abandoned and deceived. What scoundrels! Our heroine knew she needed to find a way to escape. Suddenly, he asked if she wanted revenge. Our heroine asked him in surprise what he was talking about, and in response, he took her hand and said that if she wanted to take revenge on those who were going to kill her, then he would help her. That's why he... At that moment, the girl broke free from his hands and asked him to listen to her. She asked if he'd forgotten how he'd strangled her, He'd literally almost killed her himself. In a situation like that, only he was the worst. The girl understood that there could be no talk of any revenge because she could not trust him. At that moment, the guy began to shake from the fact that he was doing the same thing as those scoundrels. Our heroine did not understand what was happening to him, but at that moment he calmed down and, taking her by the shoulder, turned to her again. As a result, the guy didn't even have time to say a word when suddenly a loud explosion was heard behind him. The reason for this was the Emperor, who created a breach in the wall, and he reminded Malin that he had told him not to do anything stupid. Our heroine was surprised that Cyanil had arrived, but the dragon didn't understand how he'd gotten in. He'd clearly sealed the door with magic. At that very moment, Cyanil noticed blood and signs of strangulation on Lindell, so he started walking towards Malane, saying that he was a damn freak. A few seconds later, he used magic and asked Lute's servant in bewilderment how he dared to do such a thing. Without even waiting for an answer, he used magic and fired a beam of flame towards the dragon. Our heroine understood that even if Cyanil was very strong, his opponent was a dragon. She needed to tell him this before a fight broke out. The girl ran up to the Emperor and asked him to stop and not attack Malane, because he was not an ordinary person. Cyanil replied that he understood that, but this freak was one of those who would die at his hands. Lindell was horrified and said that now was not the time to joke, because he was not human. Cyanil grabbed the girl and, holding her close, said he knew this wasn't a human but a dragon. Our heroine looked at the Emperor in bewilderment and asked him how long he'd known about this. Cyanil replied that he'd known about it all along. He came here knowing that he was in the Temple of Lute, and he did not want to, but the matter required delay. Continuing to look at Malane, the Emperor told him that he knew much more than he thought. That's why this time he asked them not to hide anything from him. Of course, he was addressing both Malane and Lindell. Cyanil immediately shot out a burst of flame and pierced the wall again. Malane admitted that, for a human, he had quite impressive abilities. In that case, he said that he was still curious now about how Cyanil knew that he was a dragon. At that moment, the Emperor created a portal behind him and asked why he needed to answer this question. It turned out it was a mana barrier, meaning Cyanil had decided to protect her and fight alone. She'd be stuck here helpless. The girl knew that Cyanil was strong, but she certainly shouldn't forget that his opponent was a dragon. In a fight between a dragon and a human, it's clear the dragon will win. Malane began casting his spell and asked His Majesties if his skill had truly ended with a couple of beams of flame. They immediately began to clash, using their abilities. But something was wrong. Lindell felt that, as expected, Cyanil was losing ground to Malane. This wasn't going to last, so she had to do something. She didn't know what to do or how to proceed. At that very moment, she felt a strange heat, yet this feeling of weightlessness was familiar. This is definitely Aurora's feeling. She definitely hasn't been able to use it since she signed the contract, but why have her powers returned? Even though she didn't know what was going on, if she could use Aurora now, she would be grateful. With this power, she will be able to stop these fools who don't even think of listening to her. At that very moment, she screamed and ordered them to stop. Soon an explosion occurred, and fragments fell to the ground. Cyanil asked her what had happened. The girl in turn said it was only a warning. She then said that if they didn't stop right now, she herself didn't know what might happen next. If they decided to measure their strength, then, at that very moment, something strange happened. Apparently, Lindell's body simply weakened from the strain, and she collapsed to the ground. Suddenly, all strength left her body. But why? Her body became so heavy that she couldn't even move a finger. And by the way, she was very ashamed. His Majesty ran up to her in bewilderment and asked if she was okay. What had happened to her? As always, the girl wanted to say she was fine, but at that very moment, she began coughing up blood. Malane couldn't understand why she was vomiting blood if everything except her soul was fine. The Emperor turned to Malane perplexed and asked him what had become of Lindell's soul. He ordered him to look and answer the question of what was happening to Lindell. Malane, seeing the terrifying energy emanating from His Majesty, was even a little frightened. He didn't understand what kind of energy it was. Were humans even capable of such things? Anyway, he said her soul was fine. Now Cyanil told him to call a priest, and the boy immediately ran. First he needed to save her, and then see what happened. Cyanil asked the girl if she could hear him, to which our heroine only said that she was fine. The emperor was pleased to hear this, but asked her not to worry and not to fall asleep. She had to endure even if it was difficult, because the priest would arrive soon. Looking at the pool of blood, our heroine thought and decided that everything was still strange. Before, when she was vomiting blood, she felt dizzy, as if she was about to faint. But now, she just feels like her arms have become heavier, but otherwise everything is fine. She doesn't feel any discomfort. Everything is different. Just then, Melaine arrived shouting and saying he'd found a priest. The man, surprised, said he could walk on his own. The guy said that other people told him that this was the best priest of those who were outside. The man looked at Lindell in confusion and asked if she was okay. He was already here. Lindell instantly recognized the voice. Looking at Rook, she couldn't understand why her bad feelings always came true. At that moment, the man was shouting and begging her to trust him. However, at that moment, Melaine smiled and said that he had brought the best of those who were outside. Our heroine was incredibly shocked and angry, because that was the whole problem. After some time, the priests shouted at the guys in bewilderment, asking how they could fight next to the one who had just come to her senses. This is absolutely unacceptable. The whole room was shaking so much, he thought there was an earthquake. Rook kept yelling angrily at the men for a long time, saying that fighting with your magic next to Lindell was the most stupid thing in the world. Then he turned towards Melaine and shouted even louder, telling him that he was such an impudent fellow. He couldn't understand how such a treatment could have left such marks on the lady's neck. He had never heard of such a treatment. All Melaine could do was look down in disappointment and apologize. That's exactly what he did. The man crossed himself and told the two of them to be careful. He'd be watching them no matter what. As soon as the priest left, Melaine said that, according to the priest, she became like this because she accepted the emperor's curse. Could they tell about it? Cyanil looked at him in bewilderment and decided to ask why he was so interested in this. Lindell, in turn, said that if he'd heard about it, he might as well forget it because it was all nonsense. The contents of the contract with Larocque. That's what the curse means. Then she asked the dragon if he himself couldn't see that her soul was okay. The priest said that her soul is distorted because of the curse. Can't he see that her soul is distorted? The guy looked down and said he just couldn't see it. Lindell asked, perplexed. Melaine explained that he can only recognize the existence of the soul living in the body, but he cannot see its state. He does not see the soul with his eyes, but only feels it. When he examined her, everything was fine with her, except that she was weak and tired. However, he understood that if she was okay, then she certainly shouldn't be vomiting blood. As the priest said, her soul is distorted, so it is understandable why this is happening to her, because a broken soul can destroy the body without leaving a trace. Our heroine asked in horror how this could be possible, to which the guy confidently said that it was possible. He had only heard of a man with a twisted soul once, and he was rumored to have died. The girl asked where he heard about him, and the guy said that a friend of the owner of the tavern where he often goes told him about him. Lindell chuckled to herself, saying that such a source was certainly trustworthy. Either way, he looked at her again and asked her to tell him the truth. If she told him what this curse was, maybe he could help. Our heroine, perplexed, asked him why he needed this since he wanted to kill her. Why would he do this? Melaine lowered his gaze and apologized to her, and then to the emperor, for trying to harm someone dear to him. He understood that it was difficult for him to believe, but still he sincerely wanted to help, so he leaves, but promised to return again. Again he apologized, and soon after he used magic and simply disappeared. Lindell didn't understand anything, but decided to ask Cyanil if he really knew he was a dragon from the start. The boy nodded. Our heroine, perplexed, said that he knew this, but still left her alone with him. Why? The guy said he was convinced. Lindell asked what they were talking about, to which the emperor replied that he simply hoped that he would not harm her. Lindell assumed that as soon as he left, Melaine tried to kill her. Cyanil told her he was mistaken, as he hadn't realized he was so young and stupid. Our heroine didn't understand what he was talking about. Cyanil took her hand and told her she didn't have to understand him, because it didn't matter. Lindell then decided to ask him what he thought was important. The guy kissed her hand and said they needed Melaine to save her. That was all that mattered to him. The girl suddenly reached out to him and decided to ask what he meant by the words, "I know more than you think." Cyanil told her that was exactly it. Unfortunately, he was very smart and had an excellent memory. Lindell, perplexed, asked if that was really a bad thing. The guy looked down and said she couldn't even imagine how terrible it was to remember everything she'd ever experienced, especially the misfortunes. Until now, our heroine had thought he lived a perfect life, free from any worries. But now, seeing his expression, she realized there was a deep sadness within him. They soon returned from the Temple of Loot, back to the palace. The emperor was so busy that she didn't see him at all. All this was because the emperor was distracted by her when the founding day was so soon, and the emperor had a lot of work to do. This allowed her to spend more time in her room, but she had to find something to do. Of course, the escape attempts continued unabated. Eavesdropping on what was happening outside, our heroine assumed there was no one there. Only after making sure that there was no one outside did our heroine decide that she should begin. She activated Aurora again. She wanted to test it, something like a sword. But what could she swing? Soon after, she found the perfect option: a candlestick. She immediately approached it. Taking it in her hands, she immediately realized she'd succeeded, as the aura began to transform into the candlestick. It seemed she was even doing better than before. The effects soon wore off, although the aura's use time is limited about 3 seconds at best. It would be nice if she could use it a little longer. At that very moment, the girl began to fall to the ground. Already lying on the floor, she thought it would also be nice not to have to collapse to the ground every time she used it. Her body was definitely stronger than before. Somehow she couldn't understand why she was losing strength so quickly and vomiting blood just after using Aurora. Should she take Estelle's medicine? While our heroine was pondering her next steps, Luna just entered the room. What happened next after this sighting was unsurprising. Luna immediately screamed at the top of her lungs, horrified by the sight of her mistress on the ground. After some time, our heroine was calming, the maid still saying that everything was fine with her. The girl cried and said she was completely unwell. She couldn't understand how the mistress could say this while in such a state. Our heroine looked at the maid in bewilderment and told her that she only had blood coming from her mouth. However, at that very moment, the maid screamed in bewilderment and asked, "Why?" Our heroine practically jumped up in her seat. Lindell decided to ask again, but the girl still began wiping away her tears and saying that even if she told nothing would change. Our heroine understood that things were bad, because Luna apparently was very angry. Lindell continued to assure the maid that she wasn't hurt this time. Showing her hand, she even began to point out the bruise from the previous incident, which had almost disappeared. Then she said about the wound on her knee that it healed in exactly the same way, and it was as if it had never been there. Luna pointed out in surprise that she was so good at talking about everything, but asked why she never called her day. Our heroine asked again. Perplexed, Luna explained that if she wasn't there and there were people standing outside the door, then why hadn't she ever asked them for help? Lindell wiped her face and asked in surprise why they were called when she was in such a state. The maid was incredibly angry, so she screamed and asked Lady Lindell to listen to her. Our heroine looked down guiltily, apologizing to Luna. She was pleased that she cared so much about her. Anyway, the maid asked that, next time if anything happened, be sure to call her or the knights. At that moment, someone entered the room. As it turned out, for some reason, the emperor, frightened by something, ran into it. Lindell happily said that she was glad that Mr. Sinel had come, but she knew she was in trouble because he would get it all wrong again. Only upon entering the room did His Majesty see a whole heap of blood, as well as a candlestick lying on the floor. Approaching her, he said that today was exactly the same. What excuse could he give? Last time she cut herself on the edge of the bed, and what today? Was she practicing with a candlestick? Our heroine laughed and asked His Majesty in surprise how he knew this. She really had been doing arm exercises. Sionel glared at her and asked if she was joking. The girl laughed, saying that the candlestick was just right for swinging, so she was practicing fencing. His Majesty was incredibly perplexed by her stubbornness. She'd said today was a very good day for training. At that moment, a knight entered the room and apologized, but said that he had brought the priest as requested. Soon after they switched sides with the priest, Rook remained inside, but His Majesty walked out into the corridor. Sionel couldn't figure out what the problem was. The knight apologized and said he should have been more careful. One way or another, he admitted that he did not feel any energy, and there were no signs of a fight either. Sionel bit his nails out of nerves and said that this time the same marks remained. the marks that remain after using Aurora, and they remained on the candlestick. The knight at that moment told His Majesty that he also noticed this, but still Miss Lindell cannot use Aurora. Cyanil himself understood this. Especially for Aurora, she can't control her body properly. Besides using simple objects, not a sword is very difficult for Aurora. She wouldn't be able to do it even if she wanted to. Damn! He began to scratch his head nervously, wondering what Lindell was hiding from him. At that very moment, Luna came out of the room and addressed His Majesty. The girl admitted that she wanted to tell me something, so she asked to give her a little time. Cyanil told her he was busy right now, so if it wasn't something important, she'd tell him later. The girl said it was important because it concerned Lindell. As soon as he heard this, he turned around and ordered the maid to tell her right away. The girl mentioned something was wrong with Lindell. Cyanil looked at her in confusion and asked if she'd really called him just to say that. Luna even trembled a little as she tried to gather her thoughts. Soon she said that, to be more precise, there was something odd about Lady Lindell's behavior. She's been smiling too much lately, it seems to her. But the strangest thing is, her smile looks like she's just doing it for show. Everything's fine, nothing serious. She's been repeating this phrase very often lately, although she never said it before. Lindell has become a completely different person. She's become more cautious sometimes, so categorical that it makes her shudder. However, as soon as she sees that her own maid suspects something, she begins to smile again and say those words. The Emperor sighed heavily and said he didn't understand what she wanted to tell him. He asked her to tell him everything directly. The girl clarified and said that she noticed how Lindell smiled only when he saw them, but as soon as no one is looking at her, her face becomes impartial again, and there is always something sad in her expression. The girl explained that she initially thought Ms. Lindell was doing this because she didn't want them to worry about her. She asked her to be sure to call if she felt unwell, but she showed that she was against it, saying that she did not want to show herself to anyone in such a state. Somehow Luna thinks that there is some other reason why she pushes people away that they all don't know about. At that moment, a girl appeared behind them, asking for forgiveness for interrupting them. But it seemed to her that Lindell was trying to cope with something dangerous alone. It's so dangerous that she can't ask for help, so maybe something strong has gotten in here, and Lindell is under pressure. The knight, perplexed, asked what this nonsense was, since there were no signs of penetration. They had all seen it. The other knight, however, suggested it made sense. One way or another, the girl asked for forgiveness, but reminded them that they had seen traces of the use of the auror, and so many suspicious things. At that very moment, a priest came out of the room, so the Emperor turned to him and asked how Lindell was feeling. The man said that her whole body was weak, and she had lost a lot of blood, but he checked her physical strength, and strangely enough, her body seemed healthy. Her pulse rate is the same as a healthy person's, except for a few bruises, of course. But that's minor, so she's fine. The Emperor looked at the man and said that she had lost too much blood. Was she really okay? The girl suddenly asked what if it was the attacker's blood, but the knight, calming her down, said that there was no one else there. The priest also said that he checked Miss Lindell's mouth, so it was definitely her blood. Cyanil then screamed and said that this was even stranger. She couldn't be okay after losing so much blood. The man also admitted that it was strange, because before she sometimes lost consciousness due to vomiting blood. But even if we accept the fact that she is fine, she still often faints, but she will definitely remain conscious. The man admitted that he himself could not understand what was happening, but he really wanted it. Looking at His Majesty, he merely sighed heavily and apologized. Cyanil was wondering right now if all this had anything to do with the curse he'd spoken of. No matter how hard it was and how much he didn't want to do it, he still ordered that the same abbot from the Lute Temple be brought here. The knight told His Majesty that they understood him, but decided to ask where he should be taken. Cyanil asked to be taken to the basement. Soon after, the Emperor asked to postpone all meetings because he would now go to the Empress's tomb. The boy was now determined to uncover the mystery of Lindell's illness. Damn Empress! He would personally find out if she was the one who did this. After a while, he and Melaine were walking through the basement. The boy was surprised and said he thought emperors had pompous surroundings, but he hadn't known they had such gloomy basements. Fortunately, after a while, they finally stopped. The dragon assumed they were already there. Our hero didn't dare think for long, so he immediately opened the door and rushed inside. The thoughts in his head were relatively similar. He was furious that this damn coffin was still bothering people. Mullane was surprised they'd placed the coffin in this dungeon. He wondered who lay inside, why they'd treated it this way. Looking at this coffin, His Majesty the Emperor said that this was the coffin of a criminal. Mullane immediately began examining the coffin. As far as he knew, the current Emperor Sional was famous for executing his own mother. He immediately assumed that his mother was in that coffin. Mullane turned, and after a smile asked the Emperor what he wished for. Sional looked at him in surprise and said he was thinking about what he already knew. Why would he call him if it had nothing to do with Lindell? Mullane looked at His Majesty the Emperor and thought that this guy, although he was human, had something inhuman about him, and acted as if he knew everything about him. At that moment, Sional told the dragon he was too simple. It was bad enough that he was wandering around the castle because he was worried about Lindell's. He's also conducting an investigation into the Emperor. Is he happy with him? Mullane looked at Sional in confusion and asked how he knew that. The guy said that he sent knights for him just recently, but he came running so quickly, so how could he not have guessed? He's not interested in people, but he even found out about his mother's empress. It must have been difficult back then, pretending to know nothing in front of the Emperor. Mullane was perplexed and said that even if he knew and could find out many things since he was the Emperor, how could an ordinary person find out about such things? Looking at the Emperor, he asked him who he was and what secrets he kept. Come to think of it, he'd been suspicious from the moment he met him at the temple. He acted as if he already knew him. Mullane admitted that although he is not interested in people, he remembers everyone he has ever seen. Besides, he would never forget a person with such a nasty look as his. Mullane knew for sure that he had never met him. So how did the Emperor know about him? Sional asked, surprised if it mattered whether he knew him or not. Mullane asked him again, perplexed. The guy said he didn't want to see him act like he knew everything. Sional shut him up again and told him to stop talking nonsense. Lindell was important to both of them right now. And again, the Emperor said that if it did not concern her, then there would be nothing at all connecting them together. That's why he asked again to stop chatting and check if there was a soul in this coffin. That's why he brought him here. With a heavy sigh, Mullane finally decided to get down to business. It seemed His Majesty himself had brought him here to test whether the man he personally killed had a soul. The dragon looked at Sional in surprise and asked if he was really afraid that a man killed with his own hands would simply rise again. Sional told him that even if she resurrected, he would kill her again. But if that put Lindell in danger, then everything would change. That's why he ordered the body to be checked. Mullane noticed the Emperor's grip. Previously, he thought all he could do was show off his magical tricks. Why was he so strong? He suggested he was developing new abilities when it came to Lindell Bodabachna. The boy said he understood the Emperor and would check the coffin immediately. Of course, he could have checked for the presence of a soul. After all, he came here for Lindell. So the man in this coffin cast a curse on the Emperor, which Lindell took upon herself. The entire time the trial was going on, the Emperor stood nervously to the side, biting his nails. Mullane soon declared that there was no soul there, and the woman was definitely dead. Sional was so nervous that he couldn't even control his emotions, so he constantly bit his fingers until they bled. In any case, he glanced at the pot next to the coffin and asked what was happening to it. He asked that it be checked as well. Mullane, perplexed, asked the Emperor if he had really lost his mind. How could there have been a soul in that pot? Sional ordered him to keep quiet and check immediately. Mullane sighed heavily, but he had no other choice, and he still said he wasn't a servant. Not understanding why he needed to check the pot at all, he nevertheless knelt down and lifted the lid of the pot. He asked in horror what it was. Moving away a little, the boy asked the Emperor what he had put there. Sional said it was the heart of a sorcerer. Mullane said he understood it, and he understood it was a heart, but why was it still beating if there was no soul in it? The Emperor was surprised that even he had no soul. Mullane asked him if he was listening. Sional was certain that Lindell was being harmed by a curse that left no trace. Then the curse was cast by someone other than the Empress, or it was a consequence of the curse. The Emperor racked his brain trying to figure out what was harming his beloved Lindell. Mullane, meanwhile, begged him to explain what was going on since he'd summoned him. His Majesty turned around at that moment and asked Mullane to remain in the palace. The dragon, perplexed, asked why. But in response, he received words that he would have to do something. Meanwhile, Lindell has gone so far as to have all contracts written on paper made from the bark of a 200-year-old tree. It was originally written in the Jakars region. This region, in turn, follows the southern current of the Eastern Strait. Our heroine was incredibly confused. Why the hell were these useless details included in the contract? Why did she need to know where the Jakars region was? Now she understood why Larocque had only shown her 13 pages of the contract. There could be important information there, so she couldn't simply skim through it. At that very moment, the knight knocked on Lady Lindell's door and said that guests had come to see her. The girl immediately began hiding everything in a hurry. She knew it. Of course, someone had come to her just when she was about to read the contract. A moment later, Duke Cassiars Arata entered the room and told Lady Lindell Bodabachna that they had not seen each other for a long time. Our heroine looked at him, not understanding why he had come. It would be fine even if he was a duke, but why did Julia Arita come with him, who looked at Lindell with disdain and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time? Lindell didn't understand why they had come. She never thought she'd ever meet these people. If these two came to her, it only meant that Sionel had already told them that he would make her empress. Looking at Julia, who did not take her eyes off Lindell, our heroine understood that she was the most likely candidate for empress. However, she asked to hear her that it was not she who asked to be made empress. At that moment, Cassiars asked Lindell Bodbachna how she was feeling. Our heroine smiled and showed off her muscles, saying she was feeling much better. The guy said he was very happy as they were all very worried about her. He asked the emperor many times to meet her, but he did not allow them to do so. That's why he apologizes for them coming only now. Lindell said there was no need to apologize since she was already grateful they came. Lindell understood that it was she who should ask for forgiveness, because everything was clear from Lady Julia, who did not take her eyes off her. She's probably angry at her for taking away her chance to become Empress Lady Julia. Just let her explain. Our heroine decided to ask them why they had come to see her. After all, they hadn't come to her just to see how she was feeling. Cassirs said that they came to her because they were worried about her. But still, as she said, there is another reason. In that case, our heroine asked them to explain what they had come for. Cassirs simply sat in silence for a long time. Soon he finally said one word. Empress. They came to talk about the Empress's place. Everything was exactly as Lindell thought. It was supposed to happen. Cassirs said that they heard that the emperor was going to make her empress. Lindell realized again that, as she'd expected, they were both dissatisfied. Since they'd come together, Julia was probably even more dissatisfied. In principle, it's understandable, since she lost the opportunity to become empress overnight. Of course she's upset. Still, she begged herself to calm down. She needed to explain that she wasn't interested in being the empress's replacement. Perhaps they could break Sionel's stubbornness. She asked them to continue what they had to say. However, Lindell assumed they would ask her to relinquish her position as empress, and she generally knew this anyway. At that very moment, Cassirs said he hoped she would become empress as soon as possible. At that very moment, silence fell over the room. What? Julia joined the conversation and said that both the emperor and the empire needed her, Lady Lindell Bodbachnis. Our heroine certainly didn't imagine this conversation this way. Hadn't they come to dissuade her? The emperor and the empire need her. What nonsense! The girl finally asked for clarification on what they were talking about. Why did the emperor need her, and what did the empire have to do with it? Julia, as expected, saw Lindell's surprise. They knew that even such a small thing would cause her such confusion, but still how sweet she was. Although Julia was as serious as a stone in person in her thoughts, she was ecstatic. How could Lindell be so down to earth? Then she noticed Lady Lindell's fragile, thin wrists and was surprised. Had they always been like this? They were thinner than a fork. Julia was in complete shock. What does the imperial chef even do? Can't he cook something Lindell likes? All these factors were quite annoying. She couldn't understand why the vice commander of the guard had become so weakened. Julia still expected to see her, as she remembered her earlier. Meanwhile, our heroine continued to speak of her own affairs, perplexed. The action takes us back in time to a dark alley. A girl suddenly started screaming loudly, saying she couldn't believe it. Young Lindell, perplexed, asked the robbers how they could steal someone else's property and then threaten her with it. Adults can't do that to a child. Two men, who had clearly already received retribution from Lindell, spoke about how difficult life was for them. Our heroine, nevertheless, ordered them to shut their mouths and live honestly. If she caught them again, they would be finished. Lindell was incredibly angry at the behavior of these scoundrels. Julia looked guiltily to the side the whole time. Soon the rescuer turned to the girl and asked if she was okay. In any case, she said the area was dangerous and full of suspicious people. Hearing no response, our heroine assumed the girl was from a wealthy family. She asked that next time she go with an escort. However, this time Lindell told her that she would take her to where she needed to go. She was so happy when she met her at the palace. Ever since childhood, Lindell had seemed strong and fair to her, and she expected to see her like that, and hoped she would remain that way. Yet looking at her now, even more tired, she felt even more sorry for her. That was exactly how Julia saw her. Still, she decided that too much time had passed since then, and although she looked weak inside, she was still unshakable. Julia knew that her willpower was capable of bringing His Majesty's empire into order. Only Lady Bodbachne could do such a thing. The girl stared at her so-called mentor, thinking about what she could do. She would always support her. However, Lindell had a misunderstanding because Lady Julia looked at her too suspiciously, as if she wanted to hit her. Cassiars turned to his sister and said he knew she liked Lady Bodbachne, but he still asked her to stop staring so angrily. The girl told him to shut up. Our heroine suddenly said that she would like to know why they so wanted her to accept the title of Empress. Cassier smiled and apologized. He did, however, say they had a reason. He immediately pointed out that the Emperor had been canceling meetings every day lately. Sionel has almost stopped dealing with government affairs because he is focused on other things, and he does this because of Lindell. Julia clutched her fan in anger and asked her brother to speak normally, as Lindell was uncomfortable. Cassiers immediately said he didn't blame her. She'd simply misunderstood them. His Majesty's obsession is getting worse every day, which is why she is locked up here. Cassiers even said he actually thought she was more of a victim. Lindell sheepishly asked if they really thought that. The guy then said that, as far as he knew, she still loved the Emperor too. He was convinced of this after seeing her. Cassiars concluded his words by saying that only her love could reform their mad emperor. Our heroine thought this was a rather strange conclusion. Cassiers said in any case that they needed her because she could love, and at the same time save the empire. And by the way, he asked for forgiveness for calling the emperor crazy. At that moment, Julia jumped up from her seat and said that she was worried that the empire was left to a prime minister who couldn't string two words together. Cassiars asked his sister how she could say such a thing about him, but the girl said that Lady Bodbachne would understand everything perfectly if he explained why they wanted her to become empress. The girl decided to explain everything in place of her wayward brother. The aristocracy wants to make her empress for only one reason. Her personal qualities were to blame for everything. Our heroine asked in surprise if it was really about her abilities. Julia told her that wisdom in understanding a situation, far-sighted insight, and the ability to understand people, all this belonged to her, Lady Lindell Bodbachne. She possesses all these qualities, and that is why one cannot refuse the position of Empress being the ideal candidate. Our heroine, however, said that Lady Julia also possessed the same skills. The girl sighed and said that not everyone was able to see this, but imagining Lady Lindell Bodbachne as an empress was another matter. Soon she rose from her seat and walked toward Lindell, telling her she had something she wanted to say. Our heroine knew she was displeased as expected. However, at that moment, she stood before Lady Lindell and declared that she was worthy of the title of Empress. Our heroine asked in surprise. Cassiers began telling his sister that such talk could be dangerous. Julia asked her brother to sit still and remain silent. The girl took Lady Lindell Bodbachne's hands and, with cute puppy eyes, asked if she didn't want to become empress. She even said that if Lindell so desired, she could start a rebellion. Our heroine's mood instantly changed, because now she wanted those two to leave. Lindell gave in and stopped thinking. Cassiers at this point told his sister that they had said everything they wanted, so it was time to go home. The guy then apologized to Lindell for coming so unexpectedly. Our heroine said everything was fine. Soon after they headed for the exit, Cassiers said goodbye to Lady Lindell, then noticed his upset sister and asked what had happened. The girl sighed heavily and asked Lady Lindell if she could ask her for something. Our heroine, surprised, agreed. The girl looked at Lindell and asked her to finally understand His Majesty's behavior. In her opinion, it is obvious that he is wrong in locking her up here and suppressing her, but His Majesty knows that this method is wrong. The reason for this is that His Majesty has fallen in love with the free Lady Lindell, but this is the only way for him to keep her. Unfortunately, she couldn't really understand him fully either, so on the one hand it was sad. One way or another, even if he doesn't show it correctly, His Majesty still loves her. This is what Julia wanted to convey. Lindell asked why she suddenly decided to bring this up with her. It was quite unexpected. The girl said she'd heard something was happening to her lately. Her room was a mess, and she'd started losing consciousness frequently. Cassiers said she's keeping quiet, so people can't do anything but watch more closely, but until she says anything, they can only speculate. Looking at his hands, he said that this was why they were worried about her and her health. Even if they're so uneasy and His Majesty is out of the question, they're on her side, and that won't change. It was only for this reason that the boys asked Lady Lindell to finally trust His Majesty. The action shifts to the evening of the same day, somewhere in the palace. Sionel was heading somewhere. He soon entered his office and was immediately asked why he had only just returned. Cassiers was sitting on the bed, and the Emperor immediately asked him what he was doing there. Cassiers said he had so much work that he could not leave, but it seemed the Emperor had mounted his horse again. Sionel began to anxiously scratch his head and tell the guest that if he came here to grumble, then he had better leave immediately. Cassiers stood up and shouted that he was grumbling because he was always being stubborn. He wanted to destroy everything that could threaten Lady Lindell. Such a thing was impossible. The guy kept saying that at this rate there would be no one left in Lindell's entourage. Sionel suddenly slammed his sword down on the table. The Emperor then said that if Lindell was safe in this way, he was ready to do anything. The guy told His Majesty that he still shouldn't cancel all meetings for this reason. In turn, Sionel told him that now that he had put on the dragon collar, he had another reason. Cassiers looked at the Emperor in bewilderment and asked what dragons he was talking about. Sionel approached Cassiers Areta and asked him not to try to figure everything out. He didn't want to kill him yet. His Majesty also seemed even busier than he was. He then asked if he had really gone to Lindell's. Cassiers screamed and said that he went to beg her to stop him. Some nobles are starting to rebel because meetings are constantly being cancelled. Sionel himself must understand that his reign is now on shaky ground. The Emperor's personal affairs were to blame. The man sighed heavily and told Cassiers that his grievances had grown even more intense. He asked me to stop talking about it and bring him documents on drug trafficking. He was tired of catching them. Cassiers placed several more letters on the table, saying that if he took up this, the nobles would notice. They still begged him to stop. His Majesty looked at Cassiers in bewilderment and asked if he should pay attention to what people thought of him. He asked the boy not to make him laugh and not to do anything stupid. Cassiers, as expected, found that only Lady Lindell could handle His Majesty. The boy understood that no one would listen to his words. At that very moment, someone knocked on the door. Who could it be at such a time? As it turned out, one of the knights entered the room apologizing for the late arrival. Cassiers asked what had happened. Lindell then crawled into the room and asked the knight to let her in. At that very moment, the girl saw Cassiers and Sionel in the room. The girl was surprised to see the Duke there, who asked in surprise what she was doing there so late. She was perplexed. Could Duke Areta really be here because of overtime? Besides, she noticed he looked worse than before. Lindell understood that if he worked like this every day, then it was understandable why he wanted to change the Emperor. She couldn't become Empress, but she could at least offer him her sword. At this point, Sionel angrily said that there was no point in assigning knights to her, since they were useless. Lindell understood that he didn't mince words at all. The girl said she had asked the knights to come here. Soon she bowed down and asked that those who were innocent not be punished. Anyway, she told the Emperor that she wanted to say hello to him. She did say hello after all. Sionel sighed and reminded Lindell that he'd asked her not to wander the palace alone. In any case, he wanted to know why she was so late. The girl said she had something important to tell him. She thought she was telling him and showing him with her actions, but she turned to him and said that she apparently hadn't understood him, so she decided to say it directly. She didn't want to live locked up anymore, so she asked to be let out. The emperor, as always, began to say that this was unacceptable since she was ill. Our heroine interrupted him and said that she would not die. Sionel immediately screamed and told her she was still lying to him. Lindell, however, said they were in this whole situation because she hadn't spoken up the whole time. She admitted that it all started when she said she wouldn't be with him anymore. Back then, she thought she was doing it for him. However, now everything was different. Taking the emperor's hand, she said she wanted to be by his side, but to do so, she needed to complete some business. Looking into Sionel's eyes, our heroine said that she liked him incredibly and that she would never leave him alone. She also assured him that she would not die, so she asked him to trust her and understand. Watching them, Cassiers joyfully began to think that the hour had arrived. He felt it was time for him to leave them alone. The guy immediately headed for the exit and said that he remembered some important things to do. Before leaving, he waved his hand and told them that they would see each other later and that they could talk and take their time. Soon after the door slammed shut, leaving them alone, Lindell immediately knew she was in trouble. Our heroine certainly didn't plan to stay in the room alone. Looking at the emperor, she noticed his expression. The expression on his face spoke for itself. He seemed ready to kill someone right then and there. It was in her head that Sionel would ask her, incredibly embarrassed, if she had spoken about her feelings sincerely, that she would not leave him. Lindell had to put on the sweetest smile and tell the emperor that he was the only one in her heart. At the end, they were supposed to whirl around in a dance, but apparently this plan was too naive. In any case, the girl didn't understand why he was silent. He should at least say something. Sionel suddenly said that he was listening to her so she could speak. Lindell said, surprised that he should now be the one answering her question. She wanted to hear what he thought about what she had said. The guy said what he was thinking. Our heroine then asked to find out what he was thinking about right now. The emperor looked at her and said that, in his head, he was thinking about what thoughts were stored in this little head. Our heroine couldn't understand. Was he really adding fuel to the fire? There was a better way after all. Sionel suddenly asked how much more she intended to exceed his expectations. Lindell, perplexed, asked what that meant. He wanted to know what she'd been hiding from him all this time. He thought she'd tell him or explain it to him, and that moment had finally arrived, and he was receiving her confession. In any case, he took her hand and pulled her toward him. Sionel said that was fine too, but he really couldn't handle her. Our heroine was incredibly embarrassed, so she began to tell His Majesty that at this rate her heart would jump out of her chest. At that moment, the guy kissed her hand and said that just a few minutes ago he was angry, but how nice it was to hear such words. However, Lindell at that moment covered his nose and said that if he liked it so much, he should have said so right away. Lindell was perplexed by the fact that she was so upset when he didn't answer her. Sionel asked why she was so upset if she already knew his feelings. The girl, perplexed, asked what she could possibly know. The guy told her bluntly that she knew he was in love with her. Lindell's eyes widened. He needed to pull himself together. She reminded herself that she had promised to be decisive no matter what she heard. That's why it wasn't Sionel sitting in front of her, but potato! In front of her sits a beautiful potato that will never change her behavior. Sionel approached her, perplexed, and told her that the emperor was sitting before her, yet for some reason she was thinking of something else. Looking her in the eye, he told her she was quite brave. Lindell pulled away in confusion, saying he was too close. He should realize how handsome he was. Sionel said he didn't understand what she was talking about. In any case, he turned to her again and asked her to tell him again what she had said. Lindell said he was handsome. Sionel sighed and said that wasn't what he meant. He reminded her that she had said she liked him. He asked her to say it again. The girl, surprised, said that she had already said it, and did he really want to hear it again? She said that just looking at him made her feel like her heart would break. She didn't just like him, she loved him. Sionel was incredibly happy to hear this. In response, he said that he loved her too. He had always wanted to tell her that. Lindell was overwhelmed by how handsome he was. Could the day have finally come when her unrequited love was answered? The girl smiled and said she understood him, and asked him to stop teasing her. Sionel, surprised, said he'd wanted to tell her how he felt the moment he saw her. Lindell screamed and said he was doing it again. She asked him not to tell her lies. Cyanil said he understood that she didn't believe him. One way or another, he told her that she could be angry and swear at him because it was all his fault. Our heroine asked him again in bewilderment, and soon told him that everything was fine with her, so he shouldn't cry. Cyanil admitted that he's afraid of losing her and wants to trust her. Moreover, he should trust her, but he can't. Unlike her, he has too many fears. He was too self-confident and trusted people easily, and that is how he lost everything. Holding Lindell tightly, he explained that he no longer wanted to be unhappy. The guy continued to hug her, asking her to stay close to him. He wanted to hear her say that she loved him and that she would not leave him. Our heroine stroked his head and told Cyanil that she would not leave him. She herself wants him to be happy, or rather, she has wanted him to be happy since the first time she met him. She thought she'd make him unhappy, but fortunately, that wasn't the case. The girl said she didn't know why he was so worried, but the way to not lose her was very simple. Approaching him, she said that he should continue to say the same words as he did today. At that very moment, their lips finally met. Lindell asked Cyanil to love her. Shortly after that long-awaited kiss, Cyanil stroked the girl's face and told her she could now do whatever she wanted. Lindell asked if it was true. The guy asked, surprised, if it really looked like he was lying. Our heroine smiled and said she didn't think he'd agree so quickly. Cyanil said he was still scared, but he liked seeing her free. And besides, she told him a way not to lose her, so she will trust this method. He said he was confident he could use this method and soon return to her lips. After that day, Cyanil removed the knights he had placed for Lindell because they were no longer needed. Although he still forbids her to leave the castle, she received the Empress's castle and felt calmer. After she arrived here, the pressure on her to become Empress increased. Still, she didn't plan to become Empress right away. That was inevitable, although they were all under some degree of pressure. However, our heroine only thought so until this morning. This morning, Cyanil was keeping an eye on her and even stood by her side during training. Our heroine asked him in surprise if he was busy, to which the Emperor replied that he was working right now. Can't you see it? The girl told him that if he was busy, she advised him to go to the palace to work. Cyanil reminded him that he had told her he was already working. Caring for the future Empress was also his job. He felt like she was also having trouble concentrating, so he hugged her and suggested that she take a rest today and be with him. He mentioned the fine weather today and suggested they go for a walk. The knights, in turn, watched the plot unfold intently. Lindell told the Emperor that he was busy, and besides, she couldn't concentrate because he was constantly looking at her. If he left, she'd start doing better. Cyanil sighed heavily and said she was being very cruel. He asked her if her feelings had already changed. Even the knights who were watching everything that was happening were shocked by this development of the plot. Our heroine cried out in bewilderment and told him that her feelings hadn't changed at all. They would remain the same even if he acted like a child. Lindell reminded him that the founding day was coming up soon, and he shouldn't be there. Cyanil nevertheless pointed to Cassiers. The Emperor said his talented prime minister was already taking care of all of this. Lindell assumed his talented prime minister was about to start a rebellion. Every time she sees the Duke, she feels very sorry for him. It seems to her that he is becoming thinner and more emaciated. Our heroine asked Cyanil if she could hear him. He in turn suggested they go to the gardens to rest. The girl realized that he apparently couldn't hear her after all. Lindell approached His Majesty and asked him to leave her alone, because this is not freedom. The guy looked at her again in bewilderment and asked if she really didn't want to be with him. And again that pitiful look. Our heroine told him there was no point in making such a face at her. She begged him to return to the palace quickly. Cyanil once again lowered his head and said plaintively that he had apparently gotten to hers. The boy apologized and said he would control himself. The knights behind him began to speculate that His Majesty was acting this way because he was in love with Lady Lindell. Our heroine assumed the Emperor was doing this on purpose, so she asked him directly. The young man, surprised, said he didn't understand what she was talking about. In any case, he said that if she was uncomfortable around him, then there was nothing she could do. The knights were perplexed, saying Lady Lindell was being too cruel. The girl screamed angrily and said she agreed to go into the garden with him. The Emperor smiled happily and said that in that case they should go. Lindell was absolutely furious about all this. Who knew such a reserved and cold man would suddenly change so drastically? She hated herself for allowing him to behave like this. Still, they went to the garden, and it was all only because the emperor was too nice. As soon as they reached the entrance, the boy turned to the servants and said that they wanted to be alone. Our heroine was very surprised by this because usually he always goes with them. The girl glanced at Sionel and asked why they had come here of all places. They could have walked anywhere else. Upon entering, the emperor told her that she loved flowers. Our heroine asked again, surprised. She said she prefers bouquets made of sausages, something like this. However, Sionel continued to say she prefers smaller, fragrant flowers. He pointed down and showed her some beautiful, small, neat flowers, saying that she liked those better. Our heroine, upon seeing them, was perplexed and commented on how beautiful they were. She was surprised they were there and that she liked these flowers even more than sausages. The girl asked the emperor how he knew she would like such flowers. It was surprising, after all, that he knew more about her taste than she did. Could he really be reading her mind? What should she do then, since she'd already imagined too much about him? Sionel sighed at that moment and told her she was thinking about something strange again. Taking her hand, the emperor said that only her gaze, usually involuntarily, falls on what she likes. That's why he can see every little thing, and he's been watching her even longer than she thinks. He immediately reminded her that last time he said that he wanted to tell her that he loved her from their first meeting. Looking at her, he said that he had restrained himself with all his might in order to get to know her as much as possible. Lindell thought he wasn't interested in her at all, and hadn't realized he was so attentive to her. Apparently, she knew little about him. However, he said that if she had no questions, they could move on. Smiling, he said that he wanted to show her something else, and these flowers were just the beginning. Walking through the greenhouse, our heroine thought that although she had lived in the imperial family for a long time, she had no idea that the greenhouse was so beautiful. It was so beautiful and pleasant here that it was possible to completely forget herself. But she still remembered that Sionel wanted to show her something. Just when the girl wanted to ask him about something, the emperor turned to her and said that they had already arrived. Our heroine was seeing this place for the first time and was therefore surprised. Sionel said it wasn't surprising that she didn't know, since he had forbidden everyone from approaching it. Nevertheless, he assured her that she would like him very much. After kissing Lindell, he said he hoped she would like him. Horrified, she said that wasn't the case at all. Lindell exclaimed in bewilderment and asked if they had really raised the dragon without her knowledge. Sionel, perplexed, came to his senses and looked ahead. In front of them, they saw a dragon no less surprised than they were, who was eating plants. Immediately, he, somewhat perplexed, greeted the emperor, and Lindell, who, perplexed, asked how a dragon ended up in the imperial greenhouse. Our heroine looked at Sionel and asked if what he wanted to show her was really a dragon. Nevertheless, Sionel, through grinning teeth, asked this scoundrel why he was here. Apparently, this wasn't what he had in mind. Without waiting for an answer, the emperor again asked the dragon what he was doing there. Coming closer, he told him that this was completely unbecoming behavior for a great dragon. At that moment, he guiltily turned away from them. Nevertheless, Sionel asked the dragon in surprise if he really wanted human flowers so much that he burst in here. The dragon asked the emperor to shut up, asking if he really thought he was eating them because he wanted to. Our heroine immediately realized that dragons feed on flowers, but she had never seen Larocque eat flowers. Even more surprising, however, was the fact that the emperor and the dragon spoke so boldly to each other. How long had they known each other? Although, if you think about it, Sionel hates dragons, so she couldn't tell him about the contract. So what's going on here? Sionel suddenly told the dragon he was pathetic. Lindell waved her hand and suggested that if she understood correctly, they were raising him. The emperor looked at her in confusion and asked why he would raise something like that. The dragon in turn asked why he needed to grow up with someone like that. Lindell laughed in surprise. At that very moment, the dragon ran to Lindell, explaining that he wasn't angry at her. It was all because of that evil emperor. Our heroine, perplexed, asked him how he knew her name. The dragon looked at her pitifully and asked if she really didn't recognize him. Sionel laughed and asked why she should remember him. The dragon suggested she might not remember, of course, if she was trying to forget bad memories. Then he started talking about the Temple of Loot. At that moment, our heroine, perplexed, pieced together the puzzle and came to the conclusion that this dragon was the same priest from the temple Melaine. The dragon was now glad because she recognized him. However, the girl was rather terrified because in front of her stood the same crazy dragon who had tried to kill her. After some time, Melaine assumed human form. Lindell asked the emperor what the dragon was doing there and why it was eating flowers in someone else's greenhouse. Cyanel pointed to the flowers and explained that these flowers contained mana, which was so necessary for dragons. For dragons, it is something like a symbol and life force, which is why dragons are drawn to manas, actually the same as that useless dragon Melaine objected, and said he ate them because he wanted to. Looking at the emperor, he said it was all his fault. Our heroine, for her part, didn't understand why they were arguing, but she was the one getting angry. At that point, the guy decided they could put it behind them for now, and immediately offered Lindell some flowers too. She needed to eat more of them. She was weak. The girl, perplexed, said she had no urge to eat flowers. Melaine, surprised, asked who had such a thing, so he asked her to eat faster. The girl, however, said that she really didn't need it, because she couldn't use mana. As soon as she refused Melaine, she noticed that his face instantly changed, so she decided to ask what happened. He said he now understood why she was in such a state. She couldn't use her power, even though she was a dragon. She was weakened and abandoned. The girl, perplexed, said she was human. Melaine, however, told her she didn't have to hide it, since he was a dragon too. Lindell still insisted she was human. Coming closer to her, he took her hand and said that he wanted her to be frank with him. The guy said that he understood that she could no longer trust him. But what he said next was no longer so important, because he had already started an irreversible process. Because Melaine was a little confused about who was who, Cyanel decided to remind the dragon and hit him on the head. The dragon, perplexed, told the emperor he was a madman out of his mind. Why was he fighting? Cyanel, perplexed, asked how he dared touch her. The guy assumed Lindell had nothing to say to him. He should be grateful they'd let him stock up on mana, so he'd better get lost. Melaine, nevertheless, reminded the emperor that he needed mana for the tasks he assigned him. He was putting up with everything for too long. Lindell was tired of hearing this senseless squabble, so she stood between them and told them to shut up. She started telling them they weren't children, but then why were they acting like that? Everyone needed to calm down immediately. Then she turned to His Majesty and asked what kind of work he was entrusting to the dragon. Cyanel said he gave him the job because magic could be useful. Melaine laughed in bewilderment, saying that it wasn't he who gave him the job, but he who deigned to accept it. Lindell screamed again. She assumed he'd been given a job after all. But how was magic used in the palace? No one here except Mr. Cyanel could use magic. The emperor said that if he allowed it, it would not be so difficult to use magic in the palace. But there were still restrictions. That's why you have to use 3 to 4 times more mana than usual. Melaine said that because of this, he spent so much energy that he needed mana. In this case, the girl decided to ask what kind of magic they used that caused him to lack mana. Last time he was so good at magic, so what kind of magic required so much of his strength? At that moment, the emperor responded in place of the dragon, saying that the palace barrier had recently been breached. He decided that the forces of those present within the palace were simply not sufficient. That's why he personally asked the dragon to help them. Melaine nodded and said that he had helped repair the barrier. Our heroine was surprised that Cyanel, who hates dragons, decided to ask him himself. When Laroque used magic, the barrier was strong, by the way. She clearly understood that at that moment, something was being closely hidden from her. Just a few days later, Cyanel was again busy with matters relating to the emperor. Perhaps the duke, who was barely hanging on while doing Cyanel's job, decided that at this rate he would simply die. That's why he dragged Cyanel along with him. Thanks to this, after her release, she seemed to truly feel free for the first time. Moreover, she received an invitation to a ball on the occasion of a national holiday. The girl turned to the maid and said that even though it was a ball, she didn't think the dress would suit her. She wanted to know if she could go in uniform. Luna, perplexed, asked what Ms. Lindell was even talking about. This time, she wouldn't be going there as security, but as His Majesty's partner. Our heroine, however, said that such a dress all in lace, beautiful and bright, would be more suitable for a sweet lady and not for her. Luna didn't understand what was so special about just wearing this dress. She assured her mistress that she would look beautiful in anything. Shortly after these words, she put on the dress at Lindell, and said that this dress should definitely. A moment later, she pulled it off and said that maybe the dress didn't suit her. Lindell asked if she felt the same way. Luna replied that she'd been told that dresses like these were the most popular right now. How so? Perhaps they don't have much time after all. Nevertheless, she said they would find a designer who would make a dress especially for her. She asked them to trust her. Lindell advised her to use this passion in something else, but she feels it is better to just go in the form she has always worn. Luna screamed again and said she wouldn't let her go in uniform. All the other ladies would come dressed up in all their glory. Almost with tears in her eyes, the maid told her mistress that at this ball she needed to show herself and prove who would sit in the Empress's place. She knew for sure that there had to be a dress that would suit Lady Lindell. Our heroine was thinking at this point that while she wasn't particularly opposed to dresses choosing and sewing, one was no easy task. She hadn't even tried it on yet, and she was already tired. At that very moment, a girl knocked on the door. It turned out to be Lady Julia Arita. Lindell didn't understand why she had come, but she asked to come in. As soon as the girl entered, she asked the future empress if everything was all right with her. Lindell smiled and said that she was fine, and that she could come in here. The girl thanked him, but in any case apologized for coming so unexpectedly. Looking around, she immediately realized Lindell was choosing a dress for the ball. The girl asked if they had already chosen one. Our heroine sighed heavily and said that she was still thinking, it's not that she doesn't like dresses, but Julia suddenly said that a dress is a must-have for balls. The main thing is to wear something that suits her so well that she shines. Luna looked at her mistress and said that she thought so too, but Lady Lindell wanted to wear a uniform. The uniform suited her, but she couldn't wear knight's armor to a ball. Julia, however, said that even the uniform does not necessarily have to be worn the same. Luna immediately assumed the mistress meant wearing something different from the others. Then, Lady Lindell would be the most noticeable in the crowd of girls. Julia told the maid that she'd figured it all out quickly, but she'd still made some mistakes. The girl, surprised, asked what she'd made a mistake about. Julia immediately exclaimed, saying that even in Lady Lindell's sack, she would stand out from the crowd. Such beauty couldn't be hidden. Luna said she was right. Taking the maid by the hand, Julia told her she knew a thing or two about beauty. Our heroine, meanwhile, wondered in amazement what the girls were even talking about. At that very moment, the girl turned to Nellie and asked her to bring what she had prepared. Soon after, she handed the box to Lindell and said she hoped she liked it. Our heroine, surprised, asked what it was. Opening the box, Julia said it was a gift from her. Lindell was perplexed. The uniform was so beautiful and luxurious. The girl said she designed it herself, so she might be missing something. However, if she's okay with it, she could wear it to the ball. Our heroine was shocked that she came up with the design herself. She had no idea she was about to receive such a precious gift. It was the first time she'd received something so thoughtful. Holding the box in her hands, Lindell smiled and thanked Julia from the bottom of her heart. She promised to wear it to the ball. The girl smiled at that very moment and said that she should be grateful to her. Our heroine smiled back at that moment and told the girl that her smile suited her very well. She hoped to see her smiling more often in the future. Immediately after these words, an unknown and incomprehensible silence fell over the room. Our heroine couldn't understand what was happening. Had she said something wrong? At that moment, Nellie was turning to the lady and asking her to come to her senses. The maid patted her on the back and begged her not to faint. She needed to collect her thoughts. At this point, Julia didn't even know what to do. She began to repeat herself incredibly, and her heart was beating too fast. At that moment, Nellie asked Milady to calm down, because it wasn't Lady Bodbakken standing before her, but a broom! Lindell cried out in bewilderment. The maid asked her not to say anything, otherwise Julia might die on the spot. Nellie, horrified, told Lady Lindell that she had exceeded Julia's tolerance limits. Lindell, perplexed, asked what she had done. The maid bowed down and said that they could not stay here any longer, because it could end badly for Julia, so she would take her back. Just before leaving, Julia thanked Lady Bodbakken for her words. Now she thought she had lived a good life. Lindell and Luna watched their guests leave in bewilderment, not even understanding what had just happened. Someone explained to them what had happened. Luna laughed and remarked that Lady Julia was truly a spontaneous person. Lindell couldn't help but agree. At that very moment, a puzzled Cyanil entered the room and asked what had happened that they were all so downcast. Our heroine said something surprising, which is that nothing actually happened. She said she herself would like to know the reason, if there was one. She was simply paying Lady Julia a compliment. Lindell said that a beautiful dress or a beautiful smile are often compliments. Looking at His Majesty, the girl asked why he had that expression on his face. Cyanil, at this point, told the girl that she needed to be a little more aware of her surroundings. Lindell looked at him in surprise and said that she didn't think there was anyone who thought about their surroundings more than she did. Cyanil said that was true, but Julia was still a bit of an outlier. In any case, he asked the girl not to tempt anyone but him. At that very moment, our heroine cried out in bewilderment and asked what this meant. Lindell asked who she was, tempting. Cyanil told her that if she didn't know, then he didn't know what to say either. Looking at the box in her hands, he assumed she had received a gift because Sears had boasted a lot about his sister's skill at handicrafts. Our heroine, however, took another look at this form and said that she really did have golden hands. Soon she took the uniform out of the box and showed it to her emperor. She asked if it was truly beautiful. Lindell said it was a valuable garment she had promised Lady Julia she would wear to the ball. Cyanil agreed and said it would suit her well. Anyway, he then said that, on the other hand, he felt a little sorry. Lindell looked at him in surprise and asked why. Taking her hand, the emperor said that he wanted to give her the ball gown and accessories. After all, this was the first ball they would attend together. Lindell, however, told him that they had many balls ahead of them, so he shouldn't be too upset. Anything he gave her would be special. Cyanil smiled at her and thanked her for speaking. Like that, Lindell couldn't understand how anyone could smile so beautifully. She sometimes even thought that it would be better if she were still in unrequited love. Then her heart would be healthier. By the way, she asked why he came. The guy said he'd been beaten to it, of course, but he'd had a gift for her too. The girl, perplexed, asked if it was really her birthday today. There were so many gifts. Holding out the box in his hand, the emperor said he hoped she would like it. Our heroine looked at it in surprise and asked what it was. As soon as she opened the box, the emperor immediately told her he hoped she would wear it to the ball. Now he saw that it would suit her uniform even better. Lindell looked at the gift in delight, saying how beautiful it was and how much she loved the color. The stones resembled his eyes. Cyanil suddenly touched her face and said that he wanted to make the stones the color of her eyes, but she understands that he is very greedy. He felt like he needed something that would indicate who she was with. Lindell became more and more embarrassed with each word he said and did not understand how sweet this greedy man could be. Nevertheless, the girl said she would repay him. In kind, Cyanil laughed and said that from the outside, it might seem as if he had wronged her. The girl screamed in disbelief and said that he had really done something wrong. If only he knew what he was doing to her heart. He should feel his heart explode too. Cyanil started laughing and telling Lindell that she hadn't changed at all. He couldn't understand how she could be so consistent. The girl asked not to tease her, but at that moment, Cyanil said that since he had given what he wanted, he would go. Lindell, perplexed, asked if he was leaving already. The emperor turned to her and reminded her that she loved freedom, so he thought she wanted him to leave. The girl, however, told him he didn't have to leave like that. The guy laughed anyway and said he'd be back soon. Soon our heroine was left alone with herself. Sometimes such peace seemed like a dream. She also felt like she was about to burst, because she couldn't handle the intensity. In any case, she was still able to control herself for now. However, if it gets any worse, then she might have to use the medicine Larocque gave her. Although looking at it, she understood that if it was ordinary, then there was no need to take it. With a heavy sigh, the girl asked when Larocque would finally arrive. At that moment, someone whispered to the girl who Larocque was. Our heroine jumped up in confusion. Horrified, she asked why he had entered so quietly. Melaine laughed and told her there was a way to everything. He'd heard she'd been feeling better lately. Lindell sighed and told him he could generally see her. She thought to herself that even though Melaine hadn't done anything wrong, he was already driving her crazy. At that moment, the dragon was glad that she was okay, and that this psycho, or rather the emperor, did not tell him about her condition, and he became curious. By the way, he said the smell was still faint, but he thought she was feeling better. So he was happy. Lindell asked, in surprise, if she really stank. Melaine looked at her and said she smelled like a dragon. He thought it was because she couldn't use magic. And again, he started talking about his own thing. When will he stop? Our heroine told him outright that she was tired of hearing the same old thing. She was born a human lives a human life, and will die a human too. Does Melaine understand what she's talking about? He turned away and silently said that it must be very hard for her to want to become human so much. He silently apologized. The girl, perplexed, told him that he had confused his thoughts with his words. In any case, the dragon asked if she really wanted to become human because she couldn't use mana and was of no use to anyone. Using mana wasn't that important. Our heroine said he was right. Mana was completely unimportant to her. Melaine said she was doing a great job. The main thing was that she was Lindell. The girl sighed and said they were done with that topic. Now she wanted to know why he had come to her. The guy looked at her in surprise. Our heroine assumed he'd come to tell her something important, something he'd kept secret from Mr. Sinel. Looking again at the now strange dragon, the girl ordered him to tell her why he came here. Melaine looked down in surprise and said that he only came to check on her condition. Lindell asked him to lie more convincingly, since he couldn't even look her in the eye. She asked what the problem was. Melaine remained silent, so our heroine screamed in confusion and ordered him to answer her questions. The guy, horrified, said he was about to tell her. The dragon looked at the girl and asked what she liked about the emperor. Lindell, perplexed, asked why he needed to know. Melaine said his question was whether she wanted to take this man as her partner. They say that the emperor has dragon blood in his blood, but that doesn't change the fact that he is still a man. If a human and a dragon become partners, then in the end, only she will suffer. That's why he doesn't think this person is valuable enough for her to have to go through this. Our heroine asked him if a partner was really a problem worth worrying about. Melaine, surprised, told her she was carefree. Lindell assumed that by partner, he meant the person they marry. That's a question that requires serious consideration, but she still thinks he's exaggerating. Melaine looked at her in bewilderment and asked if he was really exaggerating. He was surprised that she didn't know the importance of a partner to a dragon. The guy suggested it was because she'd been separated from her pack since childhood. Lindell didn't understand what he was talking about, but she asked him to stop looking at her with pity. Our heroine suddenly asked the dragon if the emperor had really asked him to inquire about the empress. Melaine, surprised, asked what she was talking about. He assumed the emperor had told her something about partners. Lindell asked if they were really called partners. After all, he had already asked her to become empress. Melaine's expression instantly changed. He asked again. The dragon couldn't believe this psychopath had done this. Lindell looked at the dragon in horror and asked what had gotten him so worked up. Melaine told her the emperor was out of his mind. In anger, he said that if Cyanil had been in his right mind, he would not have dared to ask her for such a thing. The guy said that he understands that Lindell likes the emperor and that she values him, but he asked them to think again about their partners. After all, he had already said it, but he would say it again. The emperor had gone mad. Lindell, however, I told him that she knew it too. Melaine looked at her and asked what she was talking about. The girl said outright that she knew he was out of his mind, but she still liked him. Apparently, something was wrong with her too. Nevertheless, she told him that if he decided to come to her to tell her about it, it was something to worry about. She understood the madness, but she couldn't let him die. Although it was shameless to ask for such a thing, she asked to stop Cyanil if he suddenly lost his temper. Melaine wanted to say something, but our heroine interrupted him and said that her first impression of him was not very good, but she thought that he was not so bad. Although she doesn't know what a dragon's partner is, she asked him not to worry so much, because what he calls a dragon's partner has nothing to do with her. Smiling at Melaine, he said he understood her words. Soon dark energy began to appear around him. Lindell asked if he was leaving. The dragon told her he should be going back, as he was there during his working hours. Our heroine, nevertheless, said she thought he'd tell her about the dragon's partners. Would he just leave? Melaine reminded her that she'd said everything would be fine, so why should he explain anything else? If she was still curious, she could come to him herself. Soon after these words, he moved back to the emperor's office, who apparently was sleeping. Melaine looked at him and asked himself if such a man was worthy of being emperor. At that moment, Cyanil suspected he'd given him too much freedom and He glanced at the dragon and told it that it was more like some kind of thieving cat. Mullane jumped. Hadn't he been asleep? He'd been sitting there with his eyes closed. Cyanil looked at the dragon in bewilderment and asked if he really would have to explain even that. Mullane looked at the emperor, thinking that he seemed dangerous and terrifying in any case. He sensed no energy from him other than human. Nevertheless, the dragon understood that as a human, everything about him seemed too unreal. The boy suddenly asked the emperor if he knew anything about the dragon's partners. Cyanil said, "It's when a dragon and his beloved exchange proof and promise to be together forever. The proof seems to be Yolene. A Yolin is like a dragon's heart, and the partner who receives it holds its owner's life in their hands. It's quite cruel, even though it's a proof of love." Mullane told him he was creepy. How could he know that so thoroughly being human, while Lindell knew nothing? The dragon suddenly screamed and told the emperor that he wanted to become Lindell's partner, since he had already asked her to become empress. Mullane slammed the table and decided to say it again. He asked Lindell not to be bothered unnecessarily, as he didn't know how his imprisonment might end. The emperor nevertheless looked into the dragon's eyes and said that he did not understand what he was talking about. Mullane shouted in anger and told him not to pretend that he didn't know anything. Cyanil suddenly stood up and told the dragon he'd been talking nonsense. He suggested he stop interfering and mind his own business. The emperor also noted that he didn't even have a mana shortage. Mullane was very angry. Looking at this freak, he didn't understand what Lindell liked so much about this guy. Although Lindell has a similar past to his, she now lives a life that is completely different from his. At this point, Cyanil continued to address the dragon and ordered him to leave his office and finally get on with his business. Mullane looked at the red thread and did not understand how the girl learned to feel affection for someone. Even though it had nothing to do with him, he still didn't want to leave it like that. Well, a few days later, the Foundation Day celebrations finally began. Everyone was in high spirits that day, as it was a major event, and the entire village was bustling with life. And the palace, by the way, was also preparing for the banquet that would take place tomorrow night. And when everyone is so busy, our heroine, who has nothing much to do, spent most of her time in the gym. She watched the knights train and even tried her hand at training herself. For the first time in a long time, she was doing what she wanted, and she seemed to be feeling better. After some time, Utilia was perplexed and asked what had happened to the exciting love triangle. As one could understand, she was now reporting on her exploits in love relationships. Our heroine, perplexed, asked what kind of love triangle they were talking about, when she said that it wasn't so. A friend told her that His Majesty himself had ordered her not to attract anyone. Basically, she said Lindell was cool. Melting the heart of His Ice Crystal Majesty is still a success. Our heroine asked if she should take these words as a compliment. At that moment, Utilia decided to ask a more personal question. She was curious to see how far they'd gone. Lindell practically spat out all the tea she'd just drunk. Our heroine, perplexed, asked her friend since when she had become curious about this. Utilia reminded her that she used to pester His Majesty every chance she got, and she was curious about how far she had gone. Lindell asked her to stop nosing around, and her friend suggested she was only being bold in words. The girl said it was her first relationship, so it was okay. Utilia said it was true. Although she pined for His Majesty, she'd never had a relationship, so she was just a newbie. At that very moment, someone behind her said that this was just proof of how pure and innocent Lindell's nature was. As it turned out, it was Julia who asked what could be stronger than a pure and innocent nature. Utilia was very surprised to see her there. She hadn't heard her approach. When had she managed to do so? Lindell greeted the girl anyway. The girl asked our heroine if she and Julia were so close that she could come to her place unannounced. Lindell said that was just how it happened. Julia suddenly assumed she'd disturbed them, as she assumed they were having tea. Our heroine said everything was fine, and she was only too happy to see her. Anyway, she asked what brought her here. The girl said she came to talk about repairs to the uniform she would be wearing. She must wear only the best. Lindell told her she tried it on last time and it fit her perfectly. She liked the design, so they could leave it as is. However, Julia said that, although it is perfect no matter what she wears, she wants to see it in person. The girl repeated several times that she wanted to see Lindell wear the uniform she had made. Lindell said she understood, but asked Julia to calm down. Perplexed, Utilia asked her friend if this was really how she'd lived while she was gone. Our heroine laughed and said that wasn't true. Then the girl said she would go and put on her uniform and that she would need to wait here. The girl said she would wait for her here. Utilia asked if she should help, to which our heroine said that she would be grateful. At that moment, something strange began to happen around Juliamana. For some unknown reason, began circling around her. Utilia was perplexed when she said that she was here, and our heroine looked at the guest in bewilderment. The girl asked Lady Areta to calm down, to which Julia, horrified, said that it was not she who was exuding it. Soon something began to emanate more and more from her, and the girl screamed and asked for help. Lindell told her friend it was a mana cluster and needed to be blocked by an auror. Utilia said she already figured it out. Our heroine was horrified by the mana accumulation, which was so large that it obscured Lady Julia. But what had happened? Lindell decided that she needed to somehow save her, while Utilia was creating the orrery. Noticing the spear hanging on the wall, our heroine immediately grabbed it because it was very useful. She thrust her spear inside the dome and began asking Lady Julia to take her hand. As soon as our heroine grabbed Julia, she screamed and asked Utilia to act now. The girl instantly began to concentrate a huge amount of aura energy. After a while, the room became quiet again. The mana had been stopped, and only the devastation spoke of the recent battle. Once Utilia had completed her task, she turned to the girls in confusion and asked if everything was okay with them. Our heroine, terrified, insisted she was fine. Yet for some reason, her heart felt like it was on fire. Why suddenly? At this time, Julia guiltily and fearfully began to say that she had not done this. Just a short while later, people ran into the room, asking what all the noise was about. A man entered and asked why the doors were broken, but then he noticed everything else. The devastation was incredible, so he asked in bewilderment what had happened. Utilia told the butler that there was a mana cluster here, with Lady Areta at the center. The girl immediately ordered that His Majesty be informed that someone from outside had attacked the imperial palace. After some time, knights gathered in the room and examined all the traces. Creon Frudante of the Imperial Guard looked closely at what they had found. In the end, that's all they were looking for in the courtyard area: mana boosters and barrier destroyers. Utilia said it was indeed an attack. She thought the mana surge experienced by low-ranking mages was strange, but it appeared in a mid-ranking mage, plus mana boosters and even barrier destroyers. All of this pointed to it being deliberate. Creon told her she was right. The girl, perplexed, asked how these bloodthirsty bastards dared to look down on the Imperial Guard so condescendingly. Pan begged her to calm down. Perplexed, Utilia asked what kind of calm they could possibly be talking about. What was the reason for the attack on a palace that had stood empty since the Emperor's ascension to the throne? The girl said their target was definitely Lindell Pan, said she knew this, which was why she asked him to calm down.